And why are we reading it? We will figure that out as we do. But there was a connection with the last thing we saw yesterday that we were discussing. Not the question of silence, but the question of the possibility of the witness being both involved and detached. And so the image of this either or of the testis and the terstis that Agamben talks about doesn't conform to her view of witness as a possible withness. Mm-hmm. So she coins this term withness. And in the talk, I think I quoted a few lines from this essay.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, if I could just add, I just said before when we were just setting it up, which would be that it's to pick up the piece within your lecture, where you raise the question of Levinas of the other, the question. Yes. So we were trying to see if there was a frame within which understanding and respecting the sort of the entanglement of life upon the planet. Yes. But still there is the question of the wounding that is inflicted by humans on each other, that does not distract us from the recognition of the necessity to reconsider the anthropocentric indifference to what our relationship to the world is. But this is just to give it a little bit of space, and it seems that psychoanalysis comes in as a one contributor to that, rather than a sort of entire way of seeing everything that then excludes the other. But that Ettinger's text, if anybody's never read an Ettinger text, I have to say 2 or 3 things just to start off with, which is she has been evolving a vocabulary since 1989. And I'm in the process with a colleague of mine of editing a complete set of her writings to enable people to see the evolution of the concepts that she has evolved, which involve putting enormous pressure on language. So it goes back to the Hella Roazen piece. So we ended that in something, there are things in language, or the language itself keeps various secrets, and one of the secrets is that there is something other than the phallocentric.
Yes.
And therefore, in order for this to happen, in the only language we have which we can communicate, which tends to be phallocentric, i.e. binary, in its either or, you have to almost perform a certain kind of a constant poetic deconstruction on language. So it's not like philosophical deconstruction, where you use language to sort of torture your minds with endlessly taking away what you give, but it actually happens in language. So the only way that you can read these texts is not to think, why doesn't she make it clear what she's saying? I want it to be, you know, in a sense, the secret to be revealed. You always have to go along, in a sense, with the way that she tries to affectively sort of circle around and repeat and go back. And she'll pick up on something from a novel like the Duras, and then see that it already, the poetry of the novel or the artwork already holds this. It's already working with this other kind of logic, the matrixial logic. So she's not inventing it and imposing it on art. She's finding it and trying to find a form of language. So these texts can be very, and there'll be a lot of, now the 25 years of her vocabulary, which if you haven't joined it, as I did in sort of 92, so I'll try and help on the way.
Yes.
But don't panic if it doesn't make any sense to you at all, because eventually its own sense surfaces.
Absolutely.
But it's that moving of your own mind into a different structure.
I think what you said was fundamental, actually. And it's the first time that we really summarize it so clearly, that, you know, how can something that appears so anthropocentric as psychoanalysis be actually a tool or a way with which to address the necessity of of moving away from human exceptionalism, which seems like a contradiction in the first instance, because it is such a human endeavor of search. But through this idea of the holding of the witness, or what we discussed yesterday, the figure that allows for the speech to occur, somehow even this discussion, even, there could be a language through which this human exceptionalist position can be challenged by the only way that we can, which is also this language, somehow. And that it...
Yeah, because the thing is, you can have, in the phallocentric, you can have the witness.
Yes.
Or you can have witness. But what Brahe Ettinger's done is to create this unspeakable word, which puts the H between it so that you are always oscillating between, in some ways, the formal position of the witness, where you are a full subject standing, looking at another full subject. Mm-hmm. But the witness is another dimension that coexists and oscillates with it, where you stand not for the person and not even for another person, but you are in another kind of provisional state of subjectivity, which opens on to what she calls the I's and the non-I's, mm-hmm. which are different from the I and the not I. So the normal thing is that I'm an I and you're a you, so I know that there's an I and a not I, or this is not I, this is a cup, this is my bracelet, this is my pen, okay? But there are other kinds of interfaces we have, or entanglements with the world, that are with non-I's, which may not be, are not full human subjects. So there's already a doorway here.
Yes.
From the full kind of thing. And what I think I was trying to say at the very end of yesterday, in my rather kind of anxious way, which was, it is my conviction that aspects of, when feminist thought attempts to put pressure on the phallocentric in all sorts of ways, whether it's in the sort of scientific mastery or in thinking about the living universe, or even thinking about subjectivity, it's identifying a desire for another way of setting ourselves in relationships to others. So it's not for women versus men, mm-hmm. right? It's that it opens this to this non-phallic pathway, which, as I said in the other intro, is already at work. It's just a matter of who finally had a reason to pay attention to it or try to formulate a language through which we might begin to reflect on it. So there's another crucial distinction between the standard I versus what is not I would be the phallic, the I with the non-I. And her fundamental premise is there is no I that is ever without a non-I.
Of course.
So the central question of the subject is to be several. Not to be multitudinous, not to be solitary, but several, so that there is no... And I think this comes out in this paper, so I think we should let Brache's words speak.
Shall I begin?
Yeah.
So, reflection around Hiroshima, mon amour, communicating. She does the same shift from communicating to communicating. Hiroshima, mon amour, this title, together with, and once again an overlapping of Nevers and love, of Hiroshima and love, and I will remember you as the symbol of love's forgetfulness, the horror of oblivion, and the taste of impossible love again, and Hiroshima, that's your name is Nevers, calls us to enter the text by Marguerite Duras of Alain René's film in a circular way, always already knowing that Hiroshima here, like Nevers, is also the inspiriting of a poetic name for love. For example, inspiriting is a word that is coined in this text to bring in the spirit.
Also
but
inspiriting, inspiring. Also.
Inspiring, inspiration, yeah. But to inspire is also to breathe. But it's something which, when you are something inspires you, it's like a trigger. But inspiriting is the entry of the spirit through which then the desire comes. So it's not a trigger. It's the entrance of something which is before the trigger. Inspiriting. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, these wordplay, coining of words. Naming love by traumatized and devastated place. Hiroshima, Nevers. Could you remind me, Nevers?
Is the place in France where she comes from, where she had So the French woman comes from Nevers.
Yes.
And that's where she had her German lover who was killed.
Yes. Exactly.
So that's the
Naming
other-
love by traumatized and devastated place is a plea for certain blindness, not knowing, impossibility, and oblivion. It's interesting that the word blindness comes in, since we've been discussing that yesterday in terms of the Din Kyu Lee piece. That's how you enter love, says the lover. You see, quote, nothing in Hiroshima, nothing. You know nothing. You don't have a memory. You only have love with which to reopen a wounded time-space already called by name. In love, then, the I accepts at least that blindness. To refragilize itself in relinquishment.
Self-relinquishment.
It's, oh, sorry. I read what I want to read. To refragilize itself in self-relinquishment. A non-I to become the cared-for blinding spot of otherness and non-seeing within itself. A spot into which the desire to see and the object of gaze will be gathered to be transformed into a provident touching gaze link, so that what is being processed as the memory of oblivion would be otherwise known. It would be communicated via traumatizing love. So in some ways we are communicating without any information passage, to go back to Daniel Heller-Rosen. So you're not communicating information, but there is a kind of a state of communication without communication, which is communicating, which is the state of being with, somehow.
Can I
Yes.
ask a question immediately?
Why don't you come?
I need some clarification
Okay.
on the memory of oblivion. The lover entering kind of, whatever it is, provisional subjectivity or, moment, encounter.
Well,
It's a term she formulated first in her notebooks, La Mémoire d'Oubli, which is that in context of being the child of Holocaust survivors, she carries the memory of what, as it were, the traumatically obliviated memory of her parents. So you can have the memory of what has been forgotten or obliterated by trauma. So it's the impress of an event that isn't, so you're not walking around knowing what you remember. It's not your personal memory necessarily, but it may be. But it's, in a sense, there is a memory trace which has no substance. It's not a memory of something. It's the memory of this...
a blind spot.
Of this
that
obliviated thing, which, in one sense, is it's the opposite of the notion that there's something happened and it got represented
Yes.
in your mind, etc. But there is, nonetheless, to go back to a kind of holding, you're held in relationship to it.
Yes, and it's the memory of what cannot be remembered. It's the memory of what cannot be witnessed, to go back to the idea that you can never, the only witnesses would be dead, so you cannot communicate completely. So I think in this particular context, she's referring to also Hiroshima. When she goes to Hiroshima, it is also obliterated, and you cannot have a memory of what the atomic bomb falling was, he's telling her. So there is a memory of an oblivion of this trauma that occurred with the atomic bomb.
Could I just pick up one? The communicated via traumatizing love. Obviously, she's the way that her essays work is that she makes these statements, and you think, oh, too much going on. But you'll see it. She'll circle back and circle back and circle back to. But it's not that communi is to insist on something passes. Something is in commons and something passes. So it's not just communication, but now we kind of just sending love messages, etc. But it is a being, going back in your language, in a sense, it's a being entangled in such a way that the process of opening up or fragilizing yourself in a relation to something else is actually traumatizing. It's not digestible, but it leaves its traces. Anyway, so.
Yes, traumatizing also because it's refragilizing in self-relinquishment. So it's traumatizing to give up one's sense of subjectivity as a whole, as some sort of whole. Where were we?
Not that you choose to do that either. Because my subjectivity necessarily.
Well, if you use the word choose, you're back in this idea of subject.
Just to make that
Do we
point,
choose anything?
just to make that point.
Yeah. Do we really choose? Are we sure? I don't know. That would bring us back to the Latour question of the gunman.
Yeah.
In a way. Okay, but that's me again. So
If
such transformation is possible, this is because already on the most archaic psychic level, love emanating from a non-I, maternal love, was traumatizing to the very fragile I, emergent subjectivity, joint in compassion within non-I, prematernal and maternal subjectivity. Punto. So, sorry, just a second. So she's looking at that, let's say the mother and the coming to world child. So the love emanating from a non-I, from the perspective of the emergent child, let's say, joint in compassion within non-I, which is the mother, which is not yet a mother, also a non-I. From the most archaic level, time, stage, and psychic position onward, the loved one is a trauma to the lover, and the lover is a trauma to the loved one. As love is folding and refolded in archaic fragility and wounds, inaccessible by phallic communication, accessed only by compassion, with passion, in Latin. Compassion seizes potential subjective grains of love, beauty, trauma. So it's the moment of giving birth is somehow inaccessible to phallic communication.
It's nothing to do with giving birth.
Well, on a symbolic, metaphorical level.
This is.
Let's explain to me, because.
So the thing is, you have to put aside everything to do with gynecology, obstetrics, maternity, okay? And imagine, so if we're trying to, so we have to imagine a kind of time space in which subjective elements, I'd have to call it subjective elements, things that have the capacity to think, to register events in life and record them and hold them, are in a co-affecting severality. That's to say, there is nothing that's going to, there's a prematernal subject. So here I am, I'm just an ordinary person. If I become a pregnant woman, I, as it were, enter into a prematernal stage.
Yes.
And the only thing that is making that prematernal is the existence of this also becoming other.
Yes.
And this other becoming other couldn't exist if there wasn't a prematernal subject.
Yes.
So it's not, here's the mother, and I've got a little bun in the oven, and I go, poof, out it comes, model. It's actually trying to make you think of what would happen if we imagined that some aspects of our subjectivity are already being solicited at the point at which two proto-subjects or non-I's are co-emerging. And each has some sense of the other, because the other is bringing about changes in the other side, but they're not the same changes. It's not that they have a joint event, and but this is a kind of, so this is this co-emergence and co-affection. Okay, so this prematernal and pre-infant is what she calls a time space.
Yes.
Now we're so trained to think of, when the minute you think of anything prenatal, you know, you either fall into kind of abortion debates, etc., and you know that everybody has life and they have the right to life. This is not going to interfere with that one, so we can put that one out, and it's not physiological. It's purely what are the psychic effects of the prolonged prenatality of the becoming human in the coexistence with another subject.
But that is also physiological.
Of course it's physiological.
Obviously.
It's obviously physiological, but what is the question of what are the psychic deposits of that that are foreclosed in any kind of discussion? Because in psychoanalysis, there is no psychic life before birth.
Yes. Exactly.
And she's saying no. There's a trail, like a kind of like a snail slime. There's a little there's a trace that crosses this absolute line they make, but so that's when she's talking about the archaic cycle level, where there are going to be ways of registering the affects of the what she's calling here the sort of the love emanating from a non-I, the maternal love, was traumatizing to the very fragile emergent subjectivity, which was joined.
But that is the child.
The child
the coming to be child.
Yeah,
yes, the becoming child.
You only become a mother and a child once you enter into a phallic space where there's two terms and they confront each other. Whereas this is proposing an element of subjectivity that precedes this from this archaic, that has these, like you have to think of sort of little lines trailing over this great divide, because once we are born, the enormity of the effect of having to survive in a non-co-emergent state is so traumatic that most of the sensitivity of the pre-birth has to be knocked out, because you have to say,
yes.
I need to breathe, I need food now, she better, I need something coming into me from outside. So everything that happens postnatally is the traumatic destruction of what she calls this matrixial web.
Yes.
Of endless, I always think, which is interesting, that she's now painting things like medusas, but it's like jellyfish. Endlessly so little, if you imagine in water, still touching and moving, and, the water's affecting, and, there's no confusion, it's not fusion, but there's a kind of endless play, and that can have that she's trying to say that some of these will be predisposing resources towards what could become the ethical orientation to the world, and that these two key effects are hospitality and compassion, right? And she has to hyphenate it because it's the capacity to sense the other the other has effects.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I am interested in her writing, because it gives a language to this idea gives let's say human language to this notion of endosymbiotic coevolution. So it gives a humanistic language to what Lynn Margulis will describe in biological terms. But my question to you would be, when you say, if this is, what is the traumatizing effect of maternal love to the very fragile I that is still yet unborn? She says, the love emanating from a non-I, maternal love was traumatizing to the very fragile I, emergent subjectivity, joint in compassion within non-I. So what is trauma
because the word trauma has to be understood not as equals something bad, it just is something for which you have no mechanism to digest. So it's going to have an impact, an affect, but you have no, as you do later, have a kind of mechanism by which you can say, oh, that's what you're saying. You really love me? Okay, that's great. Or you don't. But so you, and I mean, Freud says this very clearly. There are forms of trauma that are so jouissant that you seek constantly to repeat them. There are those that are so awful you seek constantly to forget them. But trauma doesn't mean, because it's a piercing, it doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It's not just horror. It's just anything that happens to you that cannot be just as by definition, the infant has no psychic mechanisms. So it's the recipient of absolutely everything that's happening. And again, on
Yes,
your
yes.
kind of, if we're not so frightened of the biological and the physiological, we can see that what happens, I mean, after 3 months, you've more or less got a complete, an entity. The only thing that needs 6 months to mature is the
Yes.
the inside of the lungs. For some reason, and it's interesting
that's
to do
interesting.
it, to develop the kind of talcum powder that enables the lungs to separate. So premature babies, the danger is they can't breathe because the two bit surfaces of the lungs the little things won't open, etc. So, but now we know you can keep a baby alive after 26 weeks. Physiologically, everything happens in this, what she calls this prolonged sojourn in the space of another, is in a sense being registered somehow, but not by a psychic mechanism, which is what we develop once we're born, to try and handle. It's like, did you ever see the film Short Circuit, about the little robot who used to go around saying, input, input, input? You know that one? You know, it's just like this, oh my God, input. And so we have to develop a shield.
Yeah.
But when you're in the womb, the input is mediated by the border space. That you're not,
You're
not,
in the border space.
That's why you are, you have the border space between the two subjects. There's this, because it's nothing is direct.
The water. To be physical about this, you mean the water?
No, she is not being physical.
But I am just asking you, what is this border space?
Well, you know that the infant is mediated, indeed, by the amniotic fluid, and then by the uterine wall, and then by all this stuff. But in that
liquidity. It's interesting because she's painting octopus, you just said, or jellyfish.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
But it's but that just makes it just becomes a resonance chamber,
Yes,
because the sound of the mother's voice
Yes.
speaking is then resonating in waves. So there's waves, there's impact, there's
Yes.
movement, there's rhythm. There's all these orientations. There's all sorts of things, and if so, there's a sensate creature there, picking up all sorts of things. But it's not a child; it's a
Right.
proto-subject, but a very receptive element, which is fragilized because it cannot resist anything that happens. Right? So it is traumatic, which could include this willing it into life.
Yes. For me, the most important opening up of my mind reading her text has been this, what you mentioned of thinking of the psychic life, let's say prenatal, which is not part of psychoanalysis, even not part of women's work, relational works like Melanie Klein or whatever. So that really shifts things, when you shift it to the prenatal psychic life.
But you have to have the prenatal, prematernal. It's this thing.
Yes,
the compassion within prematernal and maternal.
Yeah, prenatal meaning not just of the baby. Everything that's before is to me, this is the big kind of shift that she operates in terms of psychoanalytic writings.
Mm-hmm. The blasphemy.
The blasphemy. So
Donna Haraway's that the opening thing about blasphemy isn't a heresy. It's not in the opening of the Cyborg Manifesto, she says, "I'm going to give you a blasphemy."
Yes, that's right.
To make you think about the cyborg.
Yeah.
Which means that you're within the overall space of this set of ideas, but you're saying something that seems to challenge the most sacred beliefs.
A priori.
But a heresy is when you say, I don't believe any of it, I'm going to believe something else. So she's still within psychoanalysis, but to actually allow, basically the most important thing is to allow something that derives from a specific feminine dimension, and we'll come to why that is, so to lay down a potential level in human subjectivity, as opposed to making nothing that is related to the feminine have any significance in our understanding of human subjectivity. And the feminine isn't of women. The feminine refers to this particular time-space of the co-emergent I and non-I. Right, which means, therefore, every human being is in that space, irrespective of gender. So it's nothing to do with gender, nothing to do with sexuality, even though it is extremely erotic. But we'll come to that in due course, I think. Shall we push on?
Yes. So we were in the middle of where were we?
From the most archaic level.
Let's read
From
that
the
here.
most archaic level, time, stage, and psychic position onward, the loved one is a trauma to the lover, and the lover is a trauma to the loved one. As love is folding and refolded in archaic fragility and wounds, inaccessible by phallic communication, accessed only by compassion, compassione, compassion seizes potential subjective grains of love, beauty, trauma. And only within compassionate hospitality, those are actualized as seduction into life. Love evokes the time place of the matrixial kernel of love. Like beauty evokes the time place of the matrixial kernel of beauty, and trauma evokes that of trauma. Love evokes trauma that evokes beauty, that evokes love. At the same time place where such a woven grain repeats itself in difference and erases itself at the threshold of the impossible. Beauty, whose source is the trauma, that's interesting, because I guess she's referring to the fact that there's a dream, a kind of dream in trauma. Trauma is piercing, but also the space of a dream. Or not. Maybe I'm making a mistake. What is dream in German?
Traum.
Traum.
But this is.
But here she's making trauma.
No, that's just a break in that. It's not a break.
It's
in the
not a
word.
break in her word? You don't have it?
No.
Oh, why do I have it? This is the one she sent me.
It's a very odd text.
Break. But you have all the other breaks, do you?
Compassion is one. Yes, compassion.
Compassionate is broken.
Compassion is the word. Yeah, because she's breaking up the
Cum
ordinary.
with and passion.
Yeah.
That's broken.
That is
Okay,
broken.
Okay,
But
good. Okay, well, anyway. Beauty, whose source is the trauma, and to which it also returns and appeals, is a kind of encounter that we are trying to avoid when also aspiring to arrive at. Since it is, so tells us Rilke, the beginning of the horrible in which our psyche can hardly stand. It is a limit which, as Lacan puts it in his ethics seminar, forms the frontier of death in life, where life glimpses at death as if with a small line, okay, as if from death's side. This limit, in my view, can also stand for the passage of before life, coming into life, within a traumatic matrixial kernel of love, where the going to be born infant and the not yet mother are trans-relating. So again, another new word, not translating, not relating, but trans-relating, without relations.
Can I just stop
Yes.
you there for a minute? So, embedded in a lot of this is two big conversations. One is with Lacan, and the other was with Levinas. So Levinas has the notion of relations without relations. So Levinas's proposition is that, you know, how do we found ethics? So since it's the other stands before us, and the kind of almost in a primordial obligation, because the other is there, we are obligated to care for this other. But these are relations without relations. Okay,
Yes,
so I'm
because
caught
it's
up in
the
a
limit.
network of relations, but I don't actually say, "Oh, hi, how are you? I think you're very nice. I'll look after
Yes,
you."
yes.
Right.
Yes,
So,
because it's the limit because we perceive infinity, which we cannot know. It's the place that we relate to the other, but we don't relate because you can never know the other beyond the surface of the visage. So it's this opening up of a chasm onto infinity. He uses the word
Exactly.
that is unknowable.
But the modification she's making is to say that you are relating without relations.
Yes.
So she's just shifted the the sort of the central premise of the Levinas, which says, okay, here I meet the infinity of the other, but I'm, and in the face of the others, obviously, behind that is God saying,
Yeah.
whatever it is you're obligated to do. Okay, but she's actually saying, no, the primordial condition is relating to that which you can't relate, but it's this massively intimate and affecting other. So it's not the grand, scale of the relations without relating our access to infinity, but actually it is quite things. And then she's now as of the noughties, she began to be much more involved in this. So it's trans-relating without relating. So this trans, she's going to have the notion called the transject as opposed to the subject and the object. You have the transject and you have transjectivity. But
So interesting, this word.
and a lot of people in queer theory are really fascinated because of this, obviously the other meaning of trans.
Yes.
But it's to do with forms of ways of thinking of relations and relatability that is not premised on the one and the other, and the masculine and feminine, or the masculine and God, but it actually means that the nature of otherness is completely sprung out
In
of
this co-emergence.
in this because
Entangled, interaction.
but it's not confined within a heterosexualizing
Yes, yes.
logic.
Because there's no one other.
No.
The stand,
matrix of
Yes, it's very Karen Barad, to go back to what we were reading, from the science perspective. This interaction, that there is no this and that interact, when she changes the word from interaction to intra-action, that the two come into the world in the moment of that.
and it's very interesting. I just found on the website that the people in Ireland who are leading in the sort of the queer theoretical engagement with Bracha's work, one of these people, I was just looking him up, etc., is also working on Karen Barad.
How interesting.
So we'll get you to get.
Because everybody's working with camera.
Yeah. Well, that's right. But it's sort of.
Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you? Okay, let's just keep pushing. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a further question. The term relational aesthetics is not what she is.
No, not
But
at all.
I'd like to have some clarification,
Okay.
some elaboration on the difference between.
Not at all.
two.
Relational aesthetics is a term that is used in the early 90s, I think, by Nicolas Bourriaud, actually coming from Pierre Huyghe, from Conversations with Pierre. They had no knowledge of Bracha.
Bourriaud did.
But,
Bourriaud knew her in the 1990s.
Oh, really?
Very early.
but I don't think he read her then. He maybe went to parties or something. But he didn't. I really think that it's a completely different
Oh, it is a completely different thing.
universe.
In which ways?
And set of. It's used to say that the artwork is. It's more deriving from the social sculpture of voice in a way, but that the artwork is not. That the artwork is the practice of being together. That being together, that taking the bus and going to my grandmother's house, Pierre Huyghe's piece of whatever, 1988, or turning the stage into a radio station in the exhibition space, that being with others, the practice of being with others is the artwork. I think that was coming from participatory art from the 60s, coming from Julio Leparc and a whole idea of French grave, it none by chance came out in France, GRAV, groups of artists, collectivist practices, removing the Marxist aspect of it. But it had a lot to do with a group of people retreating. And it was not very participatory of the audience at all. I mean, usually what the audience would see are the traces of the relational moment between the artists. For example, Rikritira Vanija in an exhibition, you will see the leftovers of the meal. The meal does not occur unless it's in a private gallery when he does it at Gavin Brown, but in a museum exhibition, the meal will occur with 50 or 30 people that are the friends. So it's this community of friends that often make these relational traces very rejected by viewers because they feel like they're not part of the party. And I wasn't invited to the party kind of thing. So I think that the first big criticism of relational aesthetics came from Britain also. What is her name? Claire Bishop, where she said, no, the question is not the relations. She said, I don't agree with Claire Bishop's view either, but it's the situation. So she wanted to shift it from relational aesthetics to situational aesthetics and bring back the politics. The other critiques of it came from Charles Esch and all of the universe of the Marxist people who wanted to engage in activist art. So activist participatory artworks are in a way in dialogue and in rejection of relational aesthetics that are felt to be bourgeois and intimist.
With Tanya Bruguera and people like that. Claire Bishop's one of Claire Bishop's.
Yes.
The artist she worked with was Tanya Bruguera.
Yes, yes. But generally, all of the projects, also Ahmet Ogut,
Yeah.
for speaking about Turkey, I mean, all the projects that Charles Esch, for example, the working on Picasso in Palestine,
Yes, yes.
that you wouldn't call it a relational aesthetics project, you'd call it a kind of activist usage of the artwork, having political agency to go through that boundary of the limit and bring this Picasso to Ramallah and have this whole event. It would be far from the relational aesthetics, but now, because it has this political action, it's more close to Alfred Gell almost idea, meets Marxism, the Picasso thing, the Picasso act. How can you use the artwork? What use value? What agency does it have? So, but now that Griselda says that Nicolas Bourriot knew Braga Oettinger in the early 90s, maybe I'm wrong. I think that relational aesthetics takes the word relational from Winnicott, actually. I think that it comes from family therapy and all the early things about that family relations as being that you can't heal a person on their own. You have to interact with all the members, and the double bind would be an example of a relational situation that would be looked at by a Winnicottian. So I think that they came from that, but because I see no. But now that you say that, it opens up this trauma in a positive sense.
No, I'm just looking up because Bourriot did know Bracha through very soon, but so he must have been aware of the beginnings of that, but he has now written about her work for a big exhibition in Russia, so I was just looking up, but somehow I've managed to turn my cellular thing off, so if I turn my cellular later on.
But that might be a later interest.
Well,
I mean, I'm not so sure that Bourriot...
The central point, I think you're right to bring it up, which
Very
is,
good.
but it's relational between subjects,
Yes.
right? And obviously relationality is anything to do with sociality or connection. But this is not relational psychoanalysis. But
exactly.
it's this. The intervention comes at the level of shifting the Levinasian term.
Yes.
And one other one that I think we need just to put in, which is, of course, Lacan's seminar on ethics, is that Lacan was one of the few psychoanalysts to understand the implications of Auschwitz for psychoanalysis, and that this big text he wrote on ethics was to do with that, and he takes the figure of Antigone as the representative of the sort of condition of someone suspended between two deaths. So what happens in the story of Antigone is she's the daughter and sister of Oedipus, and she has two brothers, and they fight, and one of them fights against the law and is defeated and left outside the city to be unburied and eaten by animals. And she goes to bury him, as a result of which she is condemned to death. So
Yes.
the whole of the play takes place between her action when she knows that she's condemned to death and ultimately when she is walled up to die in a cave. So they don't kill her, they just wall her up, they're going to wall her up. So it's very kind of complicated story which has been taken up by Hegel, by Irigaray, by Judith Butler, by everybody under the sun as a sort of this figure, a very complicated figure. And so that's what, where it's
What
too
is Bracha's relation with Irigaray? Irigaray.
Nil.
Oh.
They don't have a relationship. No. No. Irigaray is absolutely a heteronormative thinker, as we know, and one who, thinks about the issue of sexual difference. And, we're going to bring back and she will think about replacing the phallus with the placenta, okay? That's a completely different theoretical universe. It's philosophical, right? Even though she is a post-Lacanian. But Bracha is not wanting to articulate sexual difference in that sort of sense. She's trying to introduce a different dimension of subjectivity. And this is why I wanted just to pick this up. We had it in the page before. The idea of the link. Where did she talk about the word of the link?
Did we use the word? I didn't
She
see the
did.
word link.
The word link did come up at some
Huh,
point.
let
Yes,
me look.
the touch and gaze link.
Ah, yes.
So
Touch also.
in Lacan,
Mhm.
as he tries to think about these very, very archaic moments of subjectivity, still on this, but always on the side of birth, he formulated this odd thing called the objet art.
Yes.
And the objets are like if you imagine a sort of, we are delimited in his theory by being cut out from an undifferentiated cloth. So in a sense, the surface of us is like a series of scars from the cuts. And that leaves the sort of sense that there was something there. So on the side of the psyche, there's a sense that there was the breast, there was the gaze, there was something that we were once connected to, and because we have been cut out from it, desire is born to get back to that state. So that's the central premise of the Lacan, that we are, because we have been cut out from something, the whole energy is directed towards making us whole again, right? And therefore, anything that you use in the world is an object for the purposes of satisfying that gap, that lack. Okay, so it's a Lacanic simple proposition. Whereas what Bracha is saying is, if we accepted the premise of this matrixial co-emergence, co-affection, right, we are not fused, cut out, lacking, desiring, right? But maybe one other set of psychic impulses are based on a yearning for a connectivity, not a yearning for the object that will make whole
Totality.
the lack that I am constituted in, right? But that I may wish to be with, right? Not for the purposes of that person being the object, like the breast that will make me feel full, or the gaze that will make me feel safe, or the lover who will make me feel whatever it is. But actually, there is a parallel, other supplementary element, which is, therefore, we have links. So she has a sort of matrixial, instead of an objet she has a link right? So the touching gaze is one of these other sort of ideas about something that's to do with connectivity or linking.
And the person who is proposing this alternative way of thinking.
Bracha.
That's right, yes, yeah, okay. So that's where some of this discussion, but in the ethics seminar of Lacan is the seminar where he talks, I lost myself, about beauty as being the thing that sort of rises up to defend us from confronting our nothingness. Whereas perhaps beauty might rise to remind us not of our nothingness, but of this, as it were, unthinkable, primordial kind of connectivity. So there might be a certain beauty, not, it's a beautiful object, I could love that, or it'll make me feel, or it's so beautiful, or it's doing something for me, but there might be a beauty in moments in which you sense the touch and gaze, or the link, so there might be a beauty in the way that you touch. So instead of thinking about Hiroshima Mon Amour as she had a lover, she lost the lover, she's got another lover, right? You know, and so as long as she's got somebody, you know, she's that. But actually, there's even as that we saw that film, there's a sort of beauty in even the terrible, terrible pain of the fragility that comes even in the story of having lost love, or not, you know, and they never kind of really communicate, that there's a different kind of non-appropriative, non-using, you know, the whole of the sort of psychoanalysis is the other is that which I need because I'm constituted in lack, or somebody I confuse for somebody else. Whereas if you're not going to confuse the world for your mother or your father, but just this almost connection, which therefore doesn't fall over into possession, which leaves you in a state where you could be a with, you know, in that kind of withness that is both with and witness. It's got a little bit of space, so you don't say, I'm just with you, you know, that closing up that gap again, which would be when you would go into a phallic mode. So this is not, the phallic mode doesn't stop happening, it always will happen, there's no outside of that. But there's this just other one, which might occur in certain kind of aesthetic experiences and certain...
Because it has formal implications in films like The Monet or in Margaret Duras' writings, which is a kind of writing that you can't read just as a straight story or a straight narrative. What she's trying to get across has formal implications.
Yes.
And I think, you know, it's what I was trying to say about To the Lighthouse in the Virginia Woolf. You could read it, it's an absolute kind of matrixial text with a terrible phallic moment right in the middle, which is the death. So, you know, that's where you can see it happening. So it's great to read. You have to read for the psychoanalytical structure by reading Bracker, but it's really, really evident in certain artworks, I think.
But you could even say some more about that in relation to, if you bring up To the Lighthouse, that you do have a story of Lily Briscoe, who's a painter, who is watching a mother and child, and then the mother dies, but then she returns to the site to paint the picture.
And only after that does the picture emerge in a particularly matrixial form, actually.
But it emerges at the point at which it's not that the woman she loved is absent, and then she paints a picture of it. She actually can find a way for the painting to hold the longing that doesn't tip into either I need, you know, I will have a replacement, or I'll, you know, fetishize the image. So it is an absolutely abstract picture, and it all depends on some kind of minute decision as to where to move something. So you get this idea of how the abstract painting could be the very place where this kind of, I don't want to use the word holding again because it's not the Winnicotting holding, but sort of, you know, in the painting sort of sense, being able to hold the sort of something that's closer to yearning or longing, because she uses the Hebrew word niksafar, which is not compelled to have, you know, or feeling total, you know, abjection of isolation. But what happens when sort of, and that's, you know, things come by you and they agitate you, they leave an affect, but it doesn't end up with this model of I'm full or I'm empty or I'm lacking or I desire. Those things do go on, but this is another relationship which we have in some sense to art, because we fragilize ourselves, like when we were watching all of those things yesterday. You relinquish something, you fragilize yourself to the effects of that which, these aren't my stories. Why the hell do I care about any of them?
But also you don't care about more. It's not that you can do this.
Yeah.
You know, you can be aware of this theoretically, but it's not something you can do. It kind of does you. You know, you're kind of, there is a kind of willingness to be open in a certain kind of way, and I think that's what Bracker articulates theoretically in the text. But it's something that you recognise when you read Bracker as a possible way of being in the world.
Yes,
Okay.
actually the first time I referred to her writings was in a footnote of an essay about William Kentridge in 1996. because it seemed the most. It was an excerpt from the Matrixual Border Zone, whatever the title is of that. Border Space, yeah. It was the best, let's say, theoretical reference I could find to describing what was going on in Kentridge's dance between the drawing, the erasure, the film, where you never know exactly, what is the artwork? I don't know. There are drawings for the projection. There are film that documents the making of the drawings. They are somehow, the artwork hovers in a space which is never stable. It's fragilized and it's unstable. So from a purely formal perspective, those works seem to me illuminated by her writings.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to go put that footnote back into. I'm going to put the footnote.
The footnote in the first Brussels.
Yeah. Okay, let's just read a little bit more together, because
where are we? Would someone? Should I continue reading? Or?
Yes.
Okay, so we were at this.
From the side of this kernel, I think.
From the side of this kernel, where sharing is always potentially traumatic, not life yet, and not only death, should be considered as a pole of subjectivity as encounter, in the feminine dimension of the human being, male or female. We just spoke about that. In love, like in extreme distress, this kernel becomes threshold for a fragile passage of the. Can't even read Bracha. This kernel becomes threshold for a fragile passage to the other. Thus, what is transgressed by aesthetic affects is not only the death frontier from life to death, but also the borderline between becoming into being from non-life and subjectivized living. And trauma doesn't stand only for horror, but also for the overwhelmness of turning livable and becoming into being in extreme fragility within the infant and other transcorporation, which is also transitive inspiration. Very beautiful the way she breaks and looks at etymology. Transcorporation, through the bodies, corpore, body.
I think we should just. So, what is crucial here is that she's having to invent all sorts of words. So, this question of life or death. You're either alive or dead. So, she's introducing the not yet life. So, the becoming life, or turning livable, or becoming into being. And the borderline becoming into being from non-life. So, it's that obviously behind that is also the Freudian death drive, right? Is that he says there is a sort of the death drive he finally identifies is actually an indication that some part of us longs not to be dead, but to be sort of non-organic again. So you have this, imagine, there you are, this little egg, a little sperm, come together, ping, oh my God, and then suddenly 16,000 million things are going on. The rest of your life, there's all this energy, and you think, please, this is just too exciting. Just stillness. Let's just be still again. So it's not, I want to be dead, I'm trying to kill myself, this, it's it. But the death drive has this, it's just, it's too much. So what she's introducing, in a sense, is not you're inorganic or you're organic, but it wasn't yet life, it's non-life, becoming life, turning livable, and that's this thing about seduction into life. What would you understand, and since the subjective affect of this hospitable already subject who offers the space for something to become. And you take that away from the specific process of producing human life, and you translate that into practices in life that not teaching, but in a sense there is a kind of seduction involved, seducing people into life, into something, and at the same time the model is you want to live beside it. So even in Levinas's notion, it says the feminine is this wonderful gesture which says, yes, you know, have my body, have my calcium, have everything. I will give you life. And that's, the feminine is the one who's prepared to sacrifice herself for the life that will live after her. And
Except you can't use those sacrificial terms if you're using Bracha.
well, but that's Levinas.
Oh, sorry.
That's Levinas. And Bracha says, no. That which wills life or seduces wishes to live beside it. Obviously, it'll end at a certain point, but it sort of stops this idea that everything the way we think about the feminine has this either, it's just simply the useful biological thing, or it's the sacrificial, gives life and then has this capacity to say, yeah, have life after me, I'm pointless, I'm useless. No. It's that's why hospitality matters. And if you translate that into, again, the struggles I think we have in education or generationally, there's all these different lines of life living even in historical terms side by side, but the orientation is to go wish something from non-life to becoming life, to co-life, and continue to be kind of connected anyway. So
Yes, so the trauma of death and the trauma of becoming in co-emerging are different.
Yeah.
But they are affectively echoing in traumatizing love. If the beauty that Rilke evokes refers to the subject that, isolated in its interior, relates to an object contracting toward itself, that is, it refers to a distinct and pivotal individual, and if, for Lacan as for Freud, the subject is constituted upon a split, a schizd from the maternal, and therefore beauty...
Schizd is one of these words where Bracha thinks in French, and every so often people who edit her work are not native English speakers, and they let these things through. There is no word in English called skis.
No, but it comes from schizo. There wasn't in French either until Guattari uses it.
Exactly. So she's borrowing that. So I think
it means split.
Severed. I retranslated it because I'm editing her work.
You have it translated?
No, I edited. I'm allowed to edit it because I'm going
what
to
did you
publish
write?
We've got the word split.
Split, severed, and sheared.
Severed, sheared.
Oh, here it is. Constituted upon a split, schized from the maternal, and therefore... So, and it turned into split?
Severed and sheared.
Severed. So you translated schized into two words. Severed and sheared.
It's that. It's not kind of, but I mean... Well, I mean, it's the sheared from...
That's interesting, though, but because for her, I think it really does... I mean, because it comes into French with schizoanalysis.
But that's when
When is that coined?
Schizophrenic. No,
Yes, that's true. It existed. When
is
is schizophrenic coined? It's mid-20th century, schizo.
Yeah, but it doesn't... But you can't make schizo into a verb. There is no schized in English. It can't be schized.
But there isn't in French either. Schize is like a neologism. In Italian also, when you say I'm schizzato...
Put it back into...
I think you need a footnote and put it back. Because in Italian too, we say, sei schizzato, but it's not in the dictionary. And it means, you're completely like, you're brainless right now. You're out of control.
Yeah,
but
she's just trying to say something that is... It's split and then severed from the mother.
Yes.
And what she's saying is you are never severed from the other. You are always in some potential relating without relations. Anyway, so I will go back to her on that word and ask what we're going to do about it.
Okay. Because it's a criticism of a certain reading of psychoanalysis and psychiatry. To criticize the word schized is like a condition is to criticize the term brought in by psychiatry, I think, and psychoanalysis.
You just use a footnote.
Yeah, footnote. But anyway, where were we? The subject is constituted upon a split, schized, severed from the maternal, and sheared from the whatever, and therefore beauty refers to the individual on the edges of the splitting border. that must incise it while producing it, then such subject fits the phallic psychic field and reveals the phallic constitution of the subject in Western unconsciousness. Yes, what a violent model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they endlessly practice it on people.
Yes.
And people come out of it skeezed.
Yes.
What do you mean by that, sorry?
Well, if you go to psychoanalysis, this is what they'll tell you. You have to be separated. You know, you're failing to separate. You know, and if you don't separate from your mother, you know, and she's the cause of everything that's awful in your life, you know, and there's this notion that you have to become, you know, constituted in this absolute separation is you know, what is given to you, and they tell you this all the time, and you're meant to believe it. And then you're meant to love them too, because they're the better than the mother, because they're there to really care for you. And you have to pay them to the pressure of that's right. Anyway, so, but this is the classic, you know, psychoanalytical subject here. Okay, so.
The limit frontier described by Lacan that separates the subject from death drive cuts the subject also from feminine corporeality and sexuality and constructs the woman as lack and her feminine rapport and jouissance as impossible and pushes prenatality and pregnancy into the realm of psychosis. For Kristeva and Lacan alike, yes, actually the petit objet A is a little bit this construction of a pushed away lack. I mean, it's the feminine that it's a very phallic, I think it's a very phallic construction, the petit objet A. This conception reflects the Freudian claim that the I's first recognition of the other mother is by rejection, and thus abjection becomes the primordial gesture in the path of primary relations with the mother, forever foreclosed to avoid psychosis. In my conception, primary compassion precedes abjection and continues alongside abjection as a primordial gesture in the path of primary relations with the mother. How wonderful. In matrixial co-emergence, primary compassion of a fragile becoming I in traumatizing love is the first access to the other mother. It doesn't pass par, that's French really, by rejection, Freud, or abjection, Kristeva. Trauma is embedded in the very affective access enabled by the affect link of primary compassion, and in the early imprints of the mother with the I, accessed and processed by the affect link of archaic fascinance. Fascinance, to be fascinated by, to be magically enchanted. Fascinance is actually enchantment.
It's actually, I'm going to,
Fascinum.
this is another
Yes.
Lacanian
Yes.
sort of game she's playing. So I just want to put this up because it's so in Lacan, in his theory of the gaze, when you see something that sort of stuns you with horror, it's as if, you know, you could see certain things that would make you dead, right? So the fascinum is when something like the evil eye or something, you know, would, you know,
yes.
like the sort of, you know, the
magic,
the snake in the Jungle
charm.
Book that sort of gets you absolutely fixated. But this comes out of her theory of the matrixial gaze. And then she found it, particularly in her other study of Duras, when she studied another novel by Duras called The Ravishment of Lolvi-Stein. And fascinance is a prolonged aesthetic encounter which potentially leads to some kind of transformation. So if one thinks about, let's say, she's using it in both prematernal and postmaternal ways. But fascinance, therefore, is a kind of disposition when you are open to and taking the time for something
that needs to happen as you encounter something else. It's going to happen to you. And if it's stopped too quickly, it just gets blocked and you get frozen into fascinum. So fascinance works, if you can think in some sense, she's saying that the proto-subject, the baby, is in this prolonged fascinance, because it's just not making sense, but it's both being, some things are happening to it, but it's there's a long time to sort of work out what this sort of co-emergence is. And then in postnatal life, she's using it specifically to suggest this is how the feminine subject learns as to what the feminine subject, by fascinance towards other women.
Huh.
Right? That they don't learn what it is to be woman because you wake up and say, oh my God, I'm missing something. You actually, if you think, you spend a lot of time thinking, what are these lumpy, grown-up things, things, if you think of, you try on all sorts of ways, and I think it links up with Butler's sense that the fascinance can extend to all sorts of people that you find you want to learn from how to be yourself, right? And so it's not this idea that somehow the little girls are only formed in a negative orientation towards the discovery that they're not little boys,
Of course.
but that there is a kind of, what is this that I'm going to grow into? What are the people that I might find? And you've got, obviously, the mother of the postnatal, but this term, mother, or
Other.
or mother, is to introduce that this primary other of the prenatal, prematernal counter has to be in the feminine.
Yes.
Because it is the mark of feminine sexuality out of which life comes. And
Yes.
there's just no two ways about it. It is corporeal.
Can fascinum become fascinance, or is phallocentristic?
Fascinum is when the phallic model.
I know, but can
It's the Latin word,
are
fascinum.
models mutually exclusive?
Yes.
They are.
What do you mean? Excuse me, could you explain?
Does fascinum ever become fascinance? Is there some objects to which you could apply, which at one point that would seem more appropriate, and then it develops into fascinance?
No, fascinum refers to the nature of an encounter, in sense where you are literally, held in horror, and you feel that this, it's a kind of freezing, right? So it's a state of being frozen in this, whereas fascinance is precisely this prolonged aesthetic encounter that can allow for transformation.
I think you're right, it's both, but we can talk about that tomorrow.
Okay,
No, I would
right,
like to understand more better. I'm looking up this, if I could look it up, because I don't understand the question here that is being brought up. I'm looking just at an etymology. I'm not checking email.
But fascinance is one of her neologisms. She's made it using, so it's in the kind of Derridian model. So where you had, if you have difference, and then he goes on to have this word différence. So a whole bunch of Bracha's words like resonance, fascinance, and then just recently she's coined the word prégnance.
That's wonderful. Use a little bit of meaningfulness as well as pregnant. But it's interesting because fascinum in Latin is connected to the phallus, actually.
Which you must never see. So anything that's why snakes coming up and,
So, but it's used by fascism. Fascism also has the same etymology. And it's used by fascism because it comes from fascio. A fascio means many sticks connected, like when you're in the countryside and you pick branches, you create a fascio of branches to carry them more easily, small twigs. That's why Mario Merz would use these fascine, small connections of twigs. But that word is connected with phallus because the fascinum is, the fascinum in Latin is this phallic amulet to protect you from bad omen. So if you have phallic power, you are not subject to the fas power of the bad omen. But the thing that I'm interested in right now is that comes from the idea that life comes from the phallus, in the phallocentric vision. Life comes from the phallus, so the bud of the small twig coming to coming out of the earth, the twig is the small phallus. So it's all about phallic power, this word, fascinum. So, but she's using it anyway. It's one of those words that are really difficult to use, but I suppose one would ask, what is phallus from? And phallus actually comes from the Greek phallos, which is connected to the Sanskrit phalati, which means the emergence of the small twig from the earth. Mm-hmm. So it's as if she's saving the word from itself.
From itself, so we go back to where it...
To the co-emergent, the worldliness. If you take it as a worldly word, it's just the small budding from a seed, because she uses kernel. We have to tell her this. I bet you she didn't do this. She uses the word kernel and seed in this text very many times. So from the kernel comes this little phalati in Sanskrit, which is the Indo-European root for the budding of any vertical thing coming out of the earth, which then becomes the phallus. So we just have to recover, we have to take it back.
All right.
It's a word to be reclaimed,
Yeah.
like revolution in Sydney and so on. It's very interesting.
Okay.
Words are fascinating, and that has something to do with Daniel Heller Roazen. We have just opened up a chasm onto a kind of, not a secret, but a mystery, which at the threshold of the mystery, which is embedded in this in the language. Now, if we say it, it's a problem, because it gets subsumed. So here it's said and here it stays for now, until someone very, very dense writes something about all this. Because if we say it too quickly, we have to hold the tongue and keep the breath. Because if we say it too quickly, it is lost. Okay. That's a moment of beauty for me.
It is. Okay.
Griselda, you started saying something about the aunts at the end that she said, but I just wondered if you could finish what you were saying.
Yeah, I was just... So is it to an extent, fascinance is about kind of slow burn duration, is it about time, and fascinum is about immediacy and speed and ejaculation maybe, or... Is it about time and duration to any extent? No.
Which brings me to the lingam.
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
You're on this...
I'm on this whole thing. No, the lingam. You know what a lingam is in Hindu practices. There's many pictures of lingams on the internet. We can look them up. It is a sacred ritual, let's say, where you're pouring milk on a stone, which is a little bit vertical, and you have red flowers around it, usually in India. So the lingam is actually this kind of feminine, masculine images. I mean, the lingam is this combination of the milk and the red flower and the stone in this ritual. Every house has a lingam, more or less.
But the os ending...
Yes.
Is a continuing condition, as it were, rather than this...
Yes, but that's what she does. You see, this is, I think, to be artistic about this and curatorial for one moment.
Yeah.
This is how artworks come into the world. In other words, what stories do we want to tell so that other stories can be told? Not stories that close, not stories of closure, not stories of witness, stories of witness. Yes, witnessing. So this is a story, the creation of the word fascinance is a story that opens the possibility for many other stories, many other words, many other searches, many other thoughts. To me, that is the generative. I mean, it's when I talk about world, it is in a state of worldliness. this text. It's what I would call a worldly text, because it's not telling us something, and closing it, but it's playing and breaking. It's those breakages of the boundaries of the frames of the language that produce the possibility of producing in this organicist way that I think of the worldly. So I think it's a worldly work of art, this text.
What we're missing out of this metamorphosis, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
Because
metamorphosis
that's-
is just constant changing, but
No, Bracker's
Oh.
metra.
metamorphosis.
Yeah.
Because that's the mechanism that moves from the break.
Yeah, to move.
It's a movement. It's not a break.
Yes.
Okay, and it underlies all these the kind
Yes.
of the movement
Yes.
of the words.
But mostly, exactly, movement, but it's more than movement, it's generation.
Well, it's a
branching out. That's why the organic is
Yeah.
nice, that one branch becomes many, which
Yeah.
is not the rhizomatic, because I have a problem with Deleuze
no,
and
but
the
you need
rhizomatic.
to read about metamorphosis.
but-
That's the mechanism.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that
So it's
underlies
not
the-
Deleuzian, because the problem with
No, it's
Deleuzian
not Deleuzian at
rhizomatic,
all.
it's like moral relativism. It's just
Yeah.
a big, no, not at
No.
all. Not at all. But he takes this idea of the plant, the eruption of the plant in the body. He speaks about the plant as if the rhizomatic somehow is related to the plant. But the problem with the rhizomatic is that it's a uniform structure of, it's more like fractals, an idea of fractals. So it's actually a phallocentric notion
Absolutely.
of the organic as somehow uniformly, the energy is always the same, like Smithson, entropy. It's like it's about controlling chaos, sort of seeing a pattern of repeated complexities that are all uniform, is controlling chaos. That's what I really hate. Whereas this idea of the branching out and the branching out and the branching out does not need to have an origin. The reason why Deleuze breaks away this origin is that if you put an origin, then you have a tree, like a power structure. But if the center is everywhere, as quantum physics says, if that origin is everywhere, you can have not a rhizomatic structure, an arboreal structure, which is, however, not a structure of power. And that's what goes on with this etymological inventions of language, and that's what worlding is, in my view. So beautiful. Let's go back.
Let's just try one.
Can someone else read? Because if I read it, we're never going to get to the end of it.
I'll read a little bit then for you. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I just
Oh,
mentioned,
yes.
but it refers to like it's a prolonged and condition. It's not the sort of things. I'm just going to answer Pamela one more time. We'll pick this up. But there could be fascinum elements and fascinance elements at the same time in anything, right? Because we are not here talking about alternative systems. We're talking about supplementary and shifting, so that we're paying attention to things that are there. And with the Deleuze, the point he counters the phallicism of psychoanalysis, the one, with the multitude. Mm-hmm. And Brache's contribution is not to simply to knock out the phallus, that we have to be phallic subjects. There's no two ways about it. It serves crucial points for our capacity to know that we're this and not that. But at the same time, there's something else, and then we go not from the one to the multitude, but from the one to the several. So I think that's what you were saying earlier, that it's some subjects, and not all, and not everyone, and not at the same time. So it's not this, and the Deleuze is phallic because it simply goes from the one to the multitude. It's just a binary opposite. You've just inverted, where you haven't actually shifted. Okay, let's try this. So now she can say, in the matrixial co-emergence, primary compassion of a fragile becoming I in traumatizing love is the first access to the other. So that's the first way that we have any access to any kind of otherness, is through primary compassion, as opposed to our first access being by rejection, by biting the nipple or casting away or separating. Trauma is embedded in the very affected access enabled by the affect link. Okay, so she's saying then that the subject, that the in this matrixial state, we have not objet are, phallic objets are, but affect links. We're being affected, and that is in the realm of the aesthetic, okay? Because we're not thinking beings as the proto-subject. We don't have a psychic mechanism, but we are sensing rhythm, movement, sound, all sorts of things. So the primordial state is aesthetic in the senses. So they are affect links. The first one is primary compassion, and then the early imprints of the other with the I, accessed and processed by the affect link of archaic fascinance, being open to, interested, responding, sensing. Now, in adult love, the being lover and the being loved are infused by such fragilizing archaic emotional tendencies that do reopen the path for re-traumatizing in the present, but also for grace and solace. So now, having posited something that is prenatal, she then says, how does this occur in the life of, now that we're subjects? There are certain kind of instances, they're ridiculous, these tables, where we might find ourselves, as in all trauma, it returns, because no trauma is known in the first instance. So it returns as in that sense. So, but that could therefore be overwhelming, traumatizing, but it also could give grace and solace. And grace is this lovely word, chesed in Hebrew, and gratia in that. And we no longer, because we no longer live in a world infused with religious languages, we've forgotten that this is actually a wonderful concept, like the notion of the grace. In Hebrew, chesed means loving kindness. So it's just a disposition towards life as opposed to a disposition towards violence. So traumatizing love evokes profound non-seeing and non-cognitive knowing. Right. As it quivers the knots of unremembering by unlocking wounded memory of the oblivion of archaic fragility and overwhelmedness. Everybody should give up the tables. It's a small catastrophe.
But why?
It's
strange, this.
Okay. The loved one, whoever this foreigner is a trauma to the lover, and the lover traumatizes the loved one in a process that has the potential of bending towards the sacrificial and flowing into death drive, but also the potential for precisely turning the sacrificial elements into solaceful providential elements already imprinted in the maternal seduction into life, by reaching up from compassion to what I have called witnessing. Thus we are supplementing the prevailing perspective of the subject as oneself, that includes Freud's rejection, I become myself because I reject. Lacan's castration, you become a subject because you're split. Christeva, you become a subject because you abject the maternal. And Levinas' notion of the sacrifice and witness. So we're going to supplement them, not replace them, with the feminine maternal matrixial perspective that articulates transsubjectivity with compassion and compassion with witnessing. I think it should be good. Compassion, which is composed of primary compassion, namely the orientation of the I, the becoming subject, and compassionate hospitality of the non-I, the becoming mother, a term that echoes sharing within suffering, belongs to the fragilizing transformative potentiality evoked in and by matrixial co-emergence. Tenderness is one expression of compassionate hospitality. It is the expression in love of the archaic linkage with the other. But love, like beauty, is pregnant with trauma, precisely because the split from the impossible femininity that includes archaic maternality is impossible. So the impossible femininity, in quotation marks, is Lacan's notion, it's you can't know it and think about it, it's just beyond anything. But so the split from that, i.e. we abject the mother, or are born and cut her away, or we're castrated and therefore that's all gone, or she gives herself up, she sacrifices. So that isn't possible. So we are, the tenderness is the expression in love of the linkage, because we can never be completely cut off from this archaic maternality. Tenderness immersed in maternal compassion and fascinance reaches the eye at its fragility. But what if such fragility would meet cruelty instead? In love, as in catastrophe, one enters the transsubjective sphere and one must work through within non-split severality. So with and in this severality, which isn't marked by splitting, but isn't equally therefore fusion. You saw nothing in Hiroshima, nothing. You know nothing. You don't have a memory. These words weave a poetic silver string stretched between horror, oblivion, and co-poetic emergence. And the double naming knots together and announces the almost impossible passage. It's not impossible, but it's almost impossible. Passage from trans-sensing, compassion, and now proto-ethical primary compassion and proto-aesthetical fascinance. So it announces the passage from these into aesthetical inspiration for ethical witnessing and communicating in a new conjunction of traumatizing love with earlier trauma and love in beauty. A silver line holding together past, present, and future, time, spaces, encounters, which, though different according to the rules of chronological time spaces and the logic of narratives, are gathered by fine aesthetic reattunement, which becomes proto-ethical in a spiritual matrixial resonance chamber, while evading social and political regulatory Marxisms.
I have a question for all of us. Why, and we sort of skimmed over the question of beauty before. Why do you think, what does she mean by beauty? Because it's a dangerous word to use. And it reminded me a little bit of a sense of the sublime when she used it before. This thing that's somehow beyond this threshold, a little bit the Levinas infinity that you cannot reach somehow. When she was talking about Rilke. So I want to understand.
There are again, another conversation is going on with Kant, which makes the distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. She will say that there are matrixial pathways to this other beauty, and there's a matrixial pathway to the sublime. So she's not folding them into each other, but that coming at the notion of beauty through Lacan. What is beauty for Lacan?
What is beauty for
Lacan?
I don't know.
It is when you almost meet death but are saved from it.
So it's very much the sublime.
No. The sublime is
when you're on the edge of a precipice, like Edmund Burke, and you could fall down on the cliff. It's so vast that you almost feel annihilated, dead. That's in the text of Burke. There's this idea of being almost overwhelmed and annihilated by this vastness.
But the Kantian sublime is when the imagination has no resources within which to make sense of what it sees, and it has to produce a concept for it. Whereas for the Kantian beauty, there is no concept. It is that which is without a concept, like your documenta. So, no concept, okay? But the sublime forces the imagination to try and master what is is overwhelming, whereas beauty, we are prepared to let it be.
In Kant.
Okay, that's my...
So what is she talking about?
We need room, but yes.
Yeah, but in the Lacanian situation, he's describing, so...
I mean, a rose in Kant can be beautiful, okay?
Yes, a natural beauty, and
but
but what
if it gets so big on your precipice,
Yes,
But Burke's concept of the sublime,
Okay, it's different.
Which
from
is
Kant.
subsequent.
Sublime, it's different from the Kantian, and I think that they're...
well, it's connected with this idea of the how big
Yeah,
the
it is.
scale
Yes.
of the overwhelmingness.
Yeah, it's to do with the scale.
But let's get to Lacan, because I still don't know what she's using beauty for.
In the seminar on the ethics, he's asking, in the relation to take the story of the Sophocles play of Antigone, and you are so deep in this ghastly family that just gets worse and worse every generation. The Labyssists. Who's that? What is I reading this about? The Labyssists and the Habists. Anyway. He's just asking, why is Antigone beautiful? Right? Because effectively the whole situation is horrific. She's the sister of her father, and her father's, blah blah blah. There's a completely confusion on that score, etc. And then she's, her one brother is a rebel and gets, left out to be eaten by the lions, and the other thing, and he's in the law and all the rest of everything. Is she's condemned to death, and she's going to be walled up. And what is the beauty of Antigone? Why are we just not so horrified that we revolt? That's what he's asking. Now I can't remember why.
What is the answer?
But the answer is to do with this thing about being suspended between two deaths.
But also it's to do with the fact that she flouts the law.
Yeah, but that's the philosophical problem. That's the Hegel. What is it? What is the nature of Antigone's gesture?
That's what makes it.
Well, what if we Google Lacan beauty? Or
No, but so let me just give you one other little story. Okay, so in Vasari there is a story where Leonardo's father meets a peasant on the road who says, I've got this beautiful piece of wood and I want a shield. Okay, I want a shield to put on my door, a fascinum to put on my door to keep away the evil eye. Do you know anybody who could? And he says, just by chance, my son's quite good at art. I'll just pop down the road to Florence and he'll do something for you. So Leonardo is in his studio and he gets this thing. He says, yes. So Leonardo, being Leonardo, says, well, I've got to do some research. So he goes and he gets every crawly, creepy bug he can get, every strange creature to try and stimulate his imagination till his studio is full of dying and decaying, grotesque things. Meanwhile, the father says, I just won't bother. He pops down the road to a sculptor and says, could you just put a kind of Medusa's head on front of this? Gives it to his peasant. 2 years later, Leonardo says to his dad, please come by the studio, I've done it. I'm finally finished, okay? So in the darkened studio on an easel, with no light, there's this object, and Ser Piero arrives to see Leonardo's work, and he sees this horror, and he falls back, and Leonardo catches him, and he says, it's okay, it's only an image. Right. So this is as near as I get to understanding the sense that, as a kind of allegory of the thing that takes you to the edge, not with, oh my God, what is this? This is enormous. It's absolutely confronting something that is the opposite of you. But then you say, no, it's all right, it's an image, it's a form, it's a holding.
But that would be the imitatio, the closeness to the copy.
No, it's not.
So he thinks it's an animal.
It's the deflection. It's the deflection from what seems to be the encounter with death to something which screens it.
But repeats it, because that story is also the story of, it's so mimetic of those monsters or combination of that he thinks it might be real and kill him. So
it's not that he thinks it's real, but he thinks he's encountering.
Well, it's monstrous too.
It's what the whatever it is, the thing, the Greek word where you set it up as to protect you. What the thing of protection against the evil eye is meant to be. But you do
talisman or
no, it's
well, whatever.
It's not the prosthesis, it's the prosopoeia or whatever. You know, the kind of medicine, you take something, you take poison to protect yourself against being poisoned.
Homeopathic.
Anyway, so in this situation...
But I still don't know what she means by beauty.
Is that this thing is, which is that What are we talking about?
Beauty, yeah. Why? What she means? Well, I'm
Until you came back.
trying to understand. Is that a pencil? Is that a hand?
That is.
It's extending to a hand.
Okay.
Saying, I have a thought.
Okay.
Okay, would you like, could you wait, you have to wait for the microphone so we don't miss it.
Thank you.
Get a drink. Would you like another coffee?
No, I'm fine.
Thank you. Sometimes when I read Bracker, certain things come to mind, and it might be an extension of your stories that allow stories. The thing that I see in her use of beauty sometimes is almost an Eastern philosophical type thought, that beauty is an acceptance of the way things are, not approving of, but that openness between people and things where you can drop the pretense and the mask, and therefore can have an encounter with the other person with all their problems, difficulties. The mask of the human being becomes a closeness that's like a Buddhist meditative form of acceptance. Then you get this sort of realization of that oneness with someone, and then it disappears. So that sort of beauty is what I'm thinking of.
That might be her use.
I don't know. That's
Well, I
what
don't
it-
know
that's what
either
it brings
because
to
she's
me.
not defining it. She just brings it in.
Yeah.
She evokes it.
So it's that complete. Alison said it earlier on, that I wrote it down because it was. She put it into the words that a willingness to be open as a possible way of being in the world.
Yes, is that in this text or?
That's what Alison was. This seems to be writing about this experience, and Alison said something about further back. In connection with it, a willingness to be open. And that's what I think can be connected with this idea of beauty somehow.
No, I think you're right, as ever, because obviously when one reads the text, there are all these different ways of going about it, and I think you're right about the kind of openness. But there is something quite specific here. She's talking to Lacan's seminar on ethics, where he's trying to talk about how, in a very different way from sort of Adorno, what can be the function of beauty or the aesthetic after atrocity. And instead of talking about the immediacy of the Algerian War or the Holocaust, he's returning to this sort of figure of Antigone, who is a sort of, in a sense, a survivor witness, who is going to have to witness her own death. And
But you're using it as a synonym, aesthetic and beauty.
no.
but-
The aesthetic is to do with the
The
mode
senses
of knowing.
Yes, the perception.
So she has, so we have aesthesis and sense, resonance, movement, all the kind of non-cognitive. So her argument is the aesthetic and the proto-aesthetic, and then the cognitive and the proto-cognitive or the non-cognitive. So there's a form of knowing. Knowing usually thinks, oh, I'm thinking, cognition. But she's suggesting there's a sense knowing.
Yes.
Right? That therefore doesn't need a cognitively constituted subject to be affected and to be
Yes.
garnering certain kinds of things.
But she uses the word beauty.
But in this case, she's using it in terms precisely of where life glimpses at death as if from death's side, where the form, where beauty is the limit at which, we encounter something in life of death. Now, in some sense, what she's going to say is we might, at certain points in the course of things like life and art, encounter something, instead of being the limit with death, which is this terrifying image that we have in Antigone, you might be non-life or becoming life or something that's, in a sense, not terrorizing.
It's almost a peaceful beauty because there's nothing you can do about that. That's it. That's sort of.
But you see, in all of your Eastern thing, there's such a problem for me with Eastern European stuff because it's taking you to a level of acceptance
right? Whereas where she's going to take this is to a level of ethics where you have to do something.
No, it's not acceptance as in condemning.
Oh, I've lost my tea in all of this.
It's facing up to.
Would you like some chocolate? Thank you.
But I think the other thing is that
I'm listening.
The other thing is that this all takes place alongside the phallic. It's not one or the other. It's something
Yes.
that passes through the phallic.
Supplements. she
Well,
says.
if that's what the metamorphic figure
Yes.
is, it's this passing through. You know, it's not possible all the time. You know, you can't even try and live it. You know, it comes and it goes. It's you know, it's not as if one can discipline yourself into the matrixial in some kind of Eastern discipline or whatever. You can't do that, okay? Because it's passing through the phallic. It's this movement that.
Well,
You know,
that's why this text, in any case, is not universal. There's no universal. I mean, she's coming from a Western Judeo-Christian
No,
but even
history.
No, but even
Well,
within-
it's not
there
Buddhist.
is no continuity between Judeo and Christianity.
No, but
that one.
let's call it Western then, if you want to call it Western or Northern. I mean, she's dealing with a legacy of texts
Yeah,
that are a production of Western
Yes.
knowledge,
Yes.
knowledges and knowledge systems.
But also
There's nothing, there's no way about it. She's not coming from Buddhism or the great compassion of Buddha. It's not coming from that tradition.
And the thing is, you also have to understand, Brache is not an academic, right? She does not have a degree in this. I mean, she has a PhD in psychoanalysis and aesthetics because she's a painter. She's an artist who's also trained as a psychoanalyst. So the people she works with are, you know, she translated Lacan's seminars. You know, she goes and has conversations with Levinas. She was a friend of Lyotard, right? She she spent the 90s with
Varela.
Deleuze and Guattari, and Varela was very important.
That's interesting to me.
She
That's
took his
what I wanna-
autopoiesis and decopoiesis. So the way to deal with it is not to approach it in a sense as I think, we know all these things. I mean, so she does know Kant and that stuff, but it's a conversation with quite specific texts, and out of that she's fabulating and fabricating a kind of theoretical universe, which is to give names to
Yes, yes.
what she knows
It's
in
actually,
this sense knowing, which is happening in her work, both as the intuitiveness of a psychoanalyst and the practice of a
Yeah, but the
painter.
reason I bring this up, sorry.
No, I was
go
just going
ahead.
to say to do with language. It's you know. Sorry. It's a continuous exercise in close reading other texts in order to be able to describe, you know, other psychoanalytic texts.
Yes.
Which is, accounts for the invention of the words, because it is literally a close. How can I convey this linguistically as well?
Of course, that's the exercise. That's why it's an artwork in a way. This text.
Yeah.
But what I meant by bringing this up of the Western matrix, of which she's part of, it's not to diminish it, but to say that there are certain a prioris that we take for granted. Like, for example, I mean, in saying, and it comes because of your rejection of the idea of Eastern notion of compassion, to say that one must combine a theory of subjectivity with this notion of matrixial border zone as a supplement is because there's also a not wanting to let go of certain principles or a prioris that, for example, there has to be some form of willful action to be an ethical subject. That's not a given, like universal given. That's just a Western idea. It doesn't mean that all other civilizations that didn't produce. First of all, we don't know what subjectivity on a daily basis is, but let's say the cultural constructs, the texts that were produced, doesn't mean that they're wrong. It's just that we can't imagine ethics outside of some sort of act that is a choice to act, to be, a kind of Arendtian basic. I mean, we can't imagine that, but it doesn't mean that everybody else, who has this total passivity is going out massacring people, because they resolved it by the idea of reincarnation. The basic idea is, I might be killing my mother, if I kill this aunt, because we've gone through so many cycles. That's the problem. So you want to detach from your close several. You want to detach from your mothers, your fathers, your children, your brothers, your aunts and uncles, because it keeps you in a state of privilege, of privileging them to all the other mothers that you've had in past lives that you don't remember. So there's this oblivion. There's a memory of an oblivion also in that worldview, which brings to a form of ethical actions, not subjectivity, which comes out of passivity. I'm just saying this to say that she's trying to work out something without going to that tradition, because she's not it's not an issue for her. It's not a problem, it's not a question. As it isn't probably for most of us who, whether academically trained or not, have just, you grow up with such loves of such texts, and you read Adorno and all this stuff, or you go back and you don't want to just throw it out of the window. Oh, let's throw it out because now in the global world we know that there's Buddhism, and we're just going to become Buddhists and go do yoga morning, afternoon, and night. But you don't want to neither do you want to give it up, nor do you want to dismiss other possible trajectories also of bees and ants and other systems that are surely ethical. They don't go off and kill each other all the time, every beehive. There's some system that is an ethical system that's running those things, that they decide to swarm, because otherwise the whole hive would die, and they decide to swarm. Why? We don't know. It's the biggest mystery, which is not clear, is why. It's impossible to predict the moment of the swarming, because we just don't understand that political, ethical system that brings to that moment. Mm-hmm. But the fact that there are many queens possible and kept in life, by the other queen for that moment of the swarming, is an interesting ethical, but completely different system, which we can never really know. It's that in that case, Levinas is right. There's this infinity of the other, to which just the visage of the other, of the swarming or of the beehive, it tells us that, and it also stops us from ever being able to go into that infinity. But anyway, that's just a thought on this debate about Buddhism.
No, I think it's a very helpful, actually, because it holds, it precisely in a sense holds their different presences in the space of discussion, because it's not about this is right or this is wrong or knocking it out, but it is the challenge to us as to how different people have tried to understand the orientations to the world.
Yes.
But why I distinguish it, because in one sense the Buddhist system has, thousands of years of its own elaboration and enactment and participation, and it is a great culture, and it's created its own monuments. This is a little tiny sort of, as you say, it's a contribution in the space of this problematic thing called psychoanalysis, that therefore
it's situated.
Situated knowledge. That's perfect. Okay, let's push us to see if we can get, because it's not a very long text, but we can see if we can go. Okay, so where did we get with
3 hours?
Okay.
3 hours.
Where were we?
Okay,
where were
beyond
you?
social and political regulatory mechanisms.
Sorry, if I can find.
Let's just see.
Matricial resonance.
Okay.
Beyond.
Okay. Okay. Beyond social and political regulatory mechanisms, the matrixial apparatus that evades them and resists them does appear in the public domain as a call for life. So it shares with life. I said
Yes,
life?
wonderful.
So it shares obviously with exactly what other traditions will do. This is on the side of life. Traumatizing love informs the psyche at the levels of beauty, questioning aesthetics, and trauma, questioning ethics, and conjoins these inquiries.
and the encounter with a foreigner more intimate to myself than my own self, an encounter that blinds us as does beauty and halts our cognitive knowledge as does trauma, is a promise of new grace, solace, and providence, no less than a risk of traumatization and new sacrifice. Here the difference between providence and sacrifice is already like a breath.
Here it says it's thready like a breath. What did you?
I got already. Maybe it's threaded like a breath.
But maybe it's already like a breath. It's interesting that we don't even have a text.
No, this is me correcting. I thought that was a misprint. Threaded like a breath. I'm not sure. Okay, threaded like a breath.
Or maybe it's already like a breath.
Via Hiroshima as name for place of trauma, devastation, horror, but also impossible love, and the impossible in love, realized by the potential for re-traumatizing, we enter in contact with that eternal blinding light that links love, trauma, and beauty, and dwells inside the blinding spot, not of the subject, but of the linking to another other, and of subjectivity as encounter itself. You don't see anything unless you breathe see, and touch see, and transcend and inspire, unless the gaze turns and returns into contact by transcensing and inspiriting, unless fine reattunement of psychic mental affective frequencies, vibrations, and intensities flutes the real from within jointness in a humble psychic position of besidedness. Unless you feel no in the passage to the other from within an enlarged subjectivity as encounter, and co-inhabits in besidedness, no coming into life will be brought forward by your insight. You feel see and feel no within the passage, at the borders of an impossibility to live, turned into a possibility of life, by the compassionate hospitality of a communicating, witnessing non-I, that dwells in tenderness within co-emergence, with a compassionate I, who, in fascinance, relinquishes itself into the space-time of oblivion.
I just want to make one point that came to my mind about her language games, which I find interesting and point out, is that she uses the trait d'union, the hyphen, in two different opposite ways. Not opposite, actually. She's proving that they're the same. She uses it to break words in two, like insight, in form, and she uses it to make new words, putting two words together, like feel see, feel know. So this double movement of connecting and disconnecting, it makes it like breathing. You know, she speaks about breathing and this repetition, so there's this. So I break the word into its etymology, so you focus on its etymology, that's the purpose of breaking it. And then I link two words to create a new word, which is like the process that made the first word anyway. It's very empowering because that process that created insight happened at some point through the emergence of language that we put together in inside. So we do it in the text, we put together feel and see. So I think it's like this very interesting breaking and connecting of language. There's like a movement of breathing.
That is very beautiful.
What's beautiful?
No, it is to break and I mean...
The trait d'union, that a link is something that puts together and also...
It's called the trait d'union in French.
Yes, the hyphen, right?
Yeah, I have to break words and connect words. That's, yes.
Well, not to break them, but to separate them into their pre-subjectivity, you know. Let's say insight is a word, so it's like a subject, but there's a pre-word, like the matricial, like the pre, this is an insight. Anyway.
I read it more like equal, besideness.
Yeah, well, exactly. Besideness, to put them back to being beside, but also to show you that, well, anyway, yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that one could analyze in her texts.
Yeah. Can I
Yeah, you have to have the.
she used the word co-inhabit.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, because we had this discussion, in the Judith Butler text about cohabitation and the in. I'm kind of interested in,
Yes.
any
Inspire.
any ideas? What could be the difference of the in and the cohabit? Yeah, I mean, in my imagining it as these two words, cohabit is less situated, maybe less.
It's less organic.
Less bordered.
Well, it's less
almost.
organic because you have habit, inhabit, co-inhabit. It's like a circles, expanding circles, which never loses anything.
But
If you
the
say,
in.
well, but habit,
Yeah.
inhabit, because cohabit is opposed to inhabit. It's two different possibilities. What do you think?
Inhabits.
Right?
I think it's another thing. Okay. Butler plods on endlessly through, overlaying Bracha by Arendt.
Mm-hmm.
So, because Butler works on the, thank you. So Butler works on the. I mean, if Butler's problem, as we were looking at it, is the question of the ethical. We do not choose with whom we co-inhabit the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, since the aftermath of genocide is to say it is not possible or just for anybody to choose with whom. We just simply live on this planet with everybody. We have to, therefore, this is our thing. So you can't, decide you're not going to live with. Okay, so that's fine. But you will remember, because you wrote the introduction to the Parallax edition, when Bracha first used this complicated...
That doesn't mean I'll remember.
Okay, but I'm Grandma Moses here.
Not
so
without the text in front of me.
But it's co-inhabit.
It was, yes.
U18, she put a U into it to make the word habit not just be the level of where you live, habitation, but something which is a sort of habit in the sense of you do it over and over again, it becomes a kind of mode. So she's playing with those two different things. So there is, as it were, a moment of
That's interesting.
habitation, because you say the proto-subject, the becoming infant, inhabits the corporality of its prematernal partner. On the one hand, that's that, but also it is a habituation. It's to laying
Repetition
down a certain kind of disposition.
Of the daily.
And the disposition is to is always to do it in a sense in the presence of other, because the central proposition she's making all the way through is there is no subject on its own. There's always, so we don't, so in relation to, go back to the Butler, you cannot choose with whom you inhabit, so you must choose to co-inhabit. And Butler is constantly trying to say, is there some basis in Levinas and others where I can say there isn't even an ethical choice, it's the absolute primary obligation. Whereas Bracha will say, as she's done recently in conversation with Butler, is you have no grounds for arguing that if you stay within the realm of phallic psychoanalysis and models of subjectivity, where the only person who can make a decision is this full subject, and this full subject is what we've seen as split. So the primary orientation to the other is that the other is separate from me. Whether it's the face that meets me in Levinas or in the Lacanian notion, the psychoanalytical notion of I'm sheared away from the maternal, the primary impulse or affect of the relation to the other is rejection, right? So if we're trying to find a sense where you can say we cannot choose with whom we co-inhabit the planet, what are your resources psychically to make people affectively say, I get it, yes, yes, yes? Because everything in your structure is to say the other is not me. It's that which I reject. I discovered the other in the act of rejection. Whereas if you say, well, you discovered the other in an affect link of compassion and hospitality, and you experienced primordial tenderness, or potentially if your mother was raped and she never wanted you, you will be deeply matrixially traumatized.
by primordial failure of hospitality, is not a happy state. You are fragilized to whatever that relationship is, so it could equally work. But you are, in general disposition, the process is the seduction into life, the desire to co-inhabituate. And that then would provide us with a sort of, an affective and psychic resource
To think political, that's
to think, when we come to say, what is my ethical disposition? What is my political choice? But the problem with with Butler is to say she's trying to build the political on the ethical, right? And they're not, and this is, people are so, anyway, it's a whole other argument, so I don't want to go into, but it's too complicated. But that's the move Bracher's making, is to say, if all of Western thinking, to go back to Carolyn's point on that people are thinking this question within the West, is that the primary response to the other is I become myself by the act of distinguishing myself from that which I am pushing away. The primary gesture of rejection, which can be then splitting or abjection or violence or spitting out or biting, doesn't leave us with anything to say what would be the archaic, affective resources disposing us towards a sense of compassion and hospitality. So co-inhabiting and cohabituation relates very much to that. You go ahead.
Yeah. Just as a response to your reading, so would the difference between the co-inhabit and the cohabit, which is Butler's word, be closer to Karen Barat's inter and intra? Because Ettinger is, thinking in terms of the I, non-I, that there is no subject. So is the relationship, we heard the little video that, that
I have something to add when you finish.
Yeah, I mean, is Butler someone who would still be more on the inter-relationship when she talks about cohabitation than the intra-relationship between people in terms of the concept of subjectivity that she has to explain, certain or use in political terms or whatever.
I have something to add, which is I think that that you're speaking about two different questions. In other words, I think Griselda was focusing on the question of habit or habiting versus habituating. And that's a different focus on the difference between Butler and Bracha, because it's the question of the relationship between habitation, living in a place, and the question of being used to something being a habit, something being of your life that you repeat and that of the not of the daily, but how do you say, of the knowing of the common life of a person. So Griselda is focusing on that.
I don't think so. Griselda was also talking about hospitality and about certain issues.
Well, that's true too. But well, maybe not then. But I'm just interpreting what I heard.
Yeah.
I mean, what I heard is that the focus. I mean, what I was stunned by is the "you" in parentheses, which brings together the idea of an architectural habitation, let's say, of house, habit, and the question of how we live in a habitual condition. Habits, we have habits, habitual, that's the you. While you, I think, we're asking, but maybe I'm also wrong about that, the presence or not of the prefix in. Okay, so, and which was not focused on by the reply. So I think the presence or not of the prefix in is your question. If Butler uses cohabit, she is indeed not focusing on some sort of, from the perspective of the subject who is living with others, because when you say inhabit, there's like some sort of a subject that's living in some place. So when you look at it from the outside, from, let's say, you are looking at it from political theory, then you can say, well, we have to cohabit the planet. We have all these different communities have to live together. So it's almost like a more political, general gaze on the problem from the outside. We have to live with others, so we cohabit. Whereas co-inhabit is almost like I have to live with others because I am inhabiting something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a different linguistic focus.
I would totally agree, but then you have many texts by Butler where she talks about fragility and opening up and the vulnerability,
Yes.
Of the
Yes,
other or
the
yourself.
grievabilities.
So that makes it really difficult to draw a line or say, why not use inhabit?
Figure that word
use
out.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe she just used cohabit without thinking about it. But too much in the sense that she is quite influenced by Donna Haraway, for example, and has read a lot of Karen Barad. I mean, when I asked her about Donna, she said that Donna's thinking really influenced her a lot, and Karen Barad is through Donna maybe. And so I don't think that there's a not knowing of the sense of interaction. I think there is in her text about love, for example, her comment on grievability.
I love this.
Oh, good.
Co-inhabit, to coexist as animals
Yeah.
of different species.
Yeah.
I was going to say.
Cohabit.
So this is co-inhabit.
But they're often used as synonyms.
cohabit.
That's why we were touching them. What does it say co-inhabit is? To inhabit or to live together. Yeah. So to cohabit is like cohabit the planet. I mean, it seems to be more of an almost external word on the politics.
I suspect it's not an issue, it's an American proofreader. They're much more strict, so they'll go for the shorter version of any English word that there is. So co-inhabit, cohabitive, they're slightly synonymous.
Yeah, but that's an easy way out of this problem, the proofreader.
Yeah. But I just think you should add to this, there's also the Bourdieu idea of the habitus, which is what he uses for trying to understand how certain kind of gendered typologies emerge and how we inhabit. So he talks about the habitus of masculinity or femininity, which are composed of all the elements. So Butler and Bourdieu were once in a very interesting debate, it's on the web somewhere, around how what she sees as the performativity of gender could relate to his notion of habitus. So there's another layer to this discussion.
And the relationship between habitus and habitat?
Obviously they don't have the same kind of Latin.
But
I mean, so again, your point about is, adding to inhabit or it's both breaking co-inhabit or cohabit to focus on the co-ness, but then also to make the inhabit or habit open itself up to both habitation on the one hand, dwelling with, sharing the planet, coexisting with, and habit in the sense of something that becomes an element of who you are.
That is intimate to us because we do it every day.
When you say people co-inhabit when they are living together or have a relationship, etc., but it becomes, as it were, a texture of your subject being, to cohabit.
And it's also an in, so it's always
a resonance. It's an in.
That's what makes the matrix in.
Actually, I think that would be like the A-N-C-E ending might be grammatically the Latin form of the Germanic levels of the gerundive.
What is it? Excuse me? What was the question?
Going back to ing.
Yes, gerund.
Right? So if she were to to Latinize that, it would be cohabitants.
Yes. Okay. Yes, it would be.
Right? So the grammatical form is either gerund or gerundive, which is the ing. So it's something that has a sort of continuous present.
Yes. Okay. So we're really good.
cold from this. I'm just going. Okay, so I'm going to push this a little bit.
Yeah, let's.
Okay, so where did we get?
Hiroshima, mon amour, is a transport
Okay.
station.
Okay, so now this is introducing a word that she formulated in the late 90s. That's very crucial to my work, that she says, okay, Hiroshima, mon amour, or as amour, is a transport station of trauma. In love, matrixial co-emergence reawakens the maternal transformational potentiality that gives rise to feel knowledge produced in and by unconscious strings and traced in shared threads that are vibrating and creating psychic mental resonance space, and vibrating and creating within a resonance space. Without this non-sexual and non-gendered, non-Oedipal and non-pre-Oedipal, yet feminine eros, and I'm just going to make the point, she draws her concept of eros from Plato's dialogues in the Symposium, and particularly the figure of Diotima, in which the original figure of Eros is not the sort of god of love, the sort of Cupid kind of character, but it's the connector, the mediator. So Eros is therefore not the sexual Eros of fully formed adult sexual love, it's the Eros of connectivity. So there is some kind of dimension of what we will later call sexuality in it, but it's a feminine eros. And so within this, so it's not sexual, it's non-gendered, it's non-Oedipal, and it's not like Kristeva or Irigere or any of the other people say, okay, we can discover the feminine, the pre-Oedipal. It just wipes that whole sort of dimension out, and yet it is feminine. And within that, traumatizing love re-traumatizes. Knowledge hovers in this shared psychic feminine matrixial border space, and one receives from the other by way of immersion within the same resonating chamber. So, again, the model of the notion of a resonating chamber is meant to free you from the medical, physiological drawings of this, to say, let's think about this proto-psychical dimension of subjectivity as it is a resonance chamber. It's a space where there's echoes and vibrations and strings that are operating. If you have in your mind, here's the border space, right? And if I do that, okay, things are happening on either side. So an event may happen and it'll have effects here and effects here, right? On the sort of the becoming I and the non-I, the becoming non-I, etc. But they're not, there's a shared event, but they're not necessarily the same effects. Okay? And they overlap, but this is what mediates, and that's the border space, and it may become a kind of a threshold. So I'm beginning to think of all of this as a shared resonance chamber in which, like you're all in this pool and something drops into the pool and the ripples are going to have effects because you're in a shared space, but you're not identical with, you're not fused with, you're not just the object of it. Okay. So, thus sexual difference is a thinking apparatus. Boy, oh boy, is that a big statement, okay? The sexual difference, thinking actually, the nature of this matrixial border space becomes a thinking apparatus. And if psychoanalysis duplicates the linkage of the unconscious psyche to the male body through the pretense that concepts like narcissism and the like are neutral and equally serve male and female individuals, the matrixial difference, starting from this rapport between the fetus and the female body psyche in the real, that's the Lacanian real, something really is happening, breaks this pretense and informs. Okay, so both literally is the thing that forms, but also then has an effect upon to inform, change its way of being, a feminine imaginary and symbolic for both males and females. Such a feminine difference allows for thinking, i.e. for us to conceptualize primary co-affectivity, border linking and border spacing in jointness,
Also allows us to think differentiation in co-emergence, and then she's created another new word, differentiation in initiatory inspiration. It is the articulation of a sense-making apparatus within subjectivity as encounter. So if you can think about how this text is working, she sets you up kind of, you feel very remote, and then you keep going round, and now you can begin to see something of what she said at the beginning, which couldn't be said straight off. It has to go through this, and now you're beginning, okay, I'm beginning to get this repetition, I'm getting habituated to, okay, subjectivity, encounter, how it's going, and it's the only way you can build this. Unremembering the memory of oblivion is now, is metamorphic, inspiring, fading in transformation that allows earlier trauma of veiled reappearing. So if you think of the film, the process of the film is she arrives, she says, this is a lovely place, it's perfect for love, I can understand everything I see, and he says, you know nothing, you've not seen anything. And then by the end of the relationship, the film cinematically, it's the only way you can do it, is constantly intersecting some of the flashes of the traumatic memory of her discovering her German lover shot. So realize that this was really what she was in all the time, but it was the memory of oblivion. You know, it had been obliviated, but it's not that she's suddenly gone back to Nevers, right? It's the actually way cinematically this intersects. It's the cinematic aesthetic makes it possible to make us perceive that she's trapped in the past, but something has been transformed by her encounter with another site of trauma that she thinks she saw, but she never saw because she was really somewhere else all the time. Right? But in something that happens which is shown to you at the beginning of not the sight of people kind of humping each other at the sort of opening, but that strange sense of the ways in which René films the bodies, touching and not touching. I mean, touching, but you don't see their faces. They're not, you know, close up. We're not thinking, oh, any moment now they're going to kiss. You know, you think of all those images that we have. It's a completely different sense of the surfaces of these bodies touching and holding. And something is happening in that which isn't presented to you in the codes of the representation of the erotic. It's represented in the meeting of, you know, people desiring to meet, and then all the way through the film he loses her and he has to find her. Again, this desire to meet, to touch, to feel, to know. And it's this inspiring fading in transformation. So it's not that she's now going to suddenly have a flashback like an ordinary film, and you'll see it, and you'll see the violence again. It's just a sliver of the film that comes in, and you see the body contracting, and you see something in her grief. It's that she's carrying with her. That's the trauma of her first love, which is going to be shifted, not taken away, not cured. We're not going to end up, oh, happy, she's now got a new lover, everything's fine. All she needed was another of these objects to make her feel whole. But she has gone on a journey through this movement into this other space to somewhere where this has come and gone and been transformed. So this love becomes the transport station of trauma, not the cure, but it was transported, it was trans-carried. And the strangeness of this Japanese man speaking a language he doesn't speak, speaking the words of this text, that nonetheless produces the moment where some transformation. So there's veiled reappearing. And the touching breath of the poetic naming testifies to this process. Hiroshima, mon amour. In traumatizing love from within and outside, in decidedness and severality, we are witnessing the trauma of the other and of the world. Now, that I think is an opening onto your worlding again, because she also dares to evoke, page 5. Have you got page 5?
No, that's it.
It's ridiculous, the way they do it. I'm sorry about the complicated. But she's also a great reader of Paul Klee, right? And she's also a reader of the people at the beginning of the 20th century who were not afraid to speak of what art's purpose and effect was, that it's something to do with the cosmos. That it's not just a relationship on the social and personal level. And it's the witnessing the trauma of the other. So there is the human other, which puts us in the realm of what you might still think is your anthropocentric and your realm of this kind of privileging of human relations. But it is a relationship, that particular one opens you, obviously, because the other is life, the other is a social world, but it's also all the entanglements, because the other isn't a singular other. The other is already a metamorphic, matrixial subject carrying traces and traces and traces of all the other his encounters, because the prematernal subject is not the mother. She herself was a becoming infant, susceptible to the traumatizing relay with her mother, who is related to her mother, and all the others that the mother, in a matrixial possibility, becomes trans-related to. So you can see how people have always been fascinated by a potential parallel between Haraway and Ettinger. And at the very beginning, when I started teaching this, a number of students who wrote theses about this, trying to see certain kinds of things, and now one can see this relationship to Brett. But they are, for me, they are distinct in the way that their passage to this way of thinking, which comes through the sciences or physics or the sort of the possible engagement with the quantum and through this, but they all dare to touch on the stuff which hitherto was in the realm of the mystic,
Yes,
or
exactly.
the religious, or the esoteric. And at the same time, what they're doing is bringing it into the realm of the ethical, political, where this is where we co-inhabit the planet. And although it is in psychoanalysis, where we started the morning, which is the primary thinking apparatus of the Western modernity for what is subjectivity, in its intersection with 20th century art and 20th century catastrophe, it has to break those boundaries. It transgresses the inherent boundaries of that tradition, not to fall into another philosophical tradition, which is what Jenny was raising, although it has that sort of friendliness with it. It's hospitable to it, without being it.
If I might just add, the thing I was going to say earlier was that it's not that I'm saying that this comes from Buddhists. It's just that the concept is, for me, easy to understand when it comes from the idea of you have to cohabit with other people is a form of acceptance, because you have to accept that other people have the right to be here, whether you like it or not.
And
You know,
also, a lot
rocks
of
are
other
hard,
things
water's
that
wet,
the
there's nothing you
people-
can do about it. You don't have to condone or say, this is, until you understand from something about the other, you can't understand or even have a judgment about what should and shouldn't be.
But Jenny,
That's the bit that I'm talking about. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying in that way of getting to know is about this other bit. Nearly there. Hang on. A compassionate hospitality of a communicating, witnessing non-I. It's that idea of not knowing where the other one is coming from or have had experience with is part of the thing that I think it means to me.
Which is perfect. Except, I'm sorry, even as you spoke, you made it very clear, quite rightly, that
as a philosophical system, Buddhism says we should and we know. And where Bracha is supplementing that is to say, should is in the realm of obligation, the ethical, and knowing is in the realm of the cognitive.
Yeah.
Is there any contribution that could come from Western theories of subjectivity that focus on affects, tendencies, subjective dispositions towards the world, that provides the kind of affective and psychic fuel, resources, streams, which would underpin that desired proposition? So you can say we should co-inhabit the world, but if the primary ways that we have been formed and in fact then constantly reasserted in the every element of the imaginary and symbolic is that the other is an instrument for us, or towards which we should, once you frame it as the should, it's a code, it's an obligation, it's a principle, it's a discipline. But if behind it is a notion of everything that I'm constituted at is that the other might be too much for me, or too little, or overwhelming, or dangerous, or I must reject it. But if you say, well, no, actually, the very condition of human life itself, as it moves from non-life to life, is being solicited by an affect of hospitality that disposes it to compassion, to this, not just I'm very compassionate towards, but that you will suffer with, you're sensorily sort of fragilized too. There's a whole different basis on which you could then say, I act. I don't act towards the other because I'm a good person or because the system tells me I should. I act because my humanity is co-humanity. There is no other, there's no moment where I could say, well, I don't feel like it today, right?
Yes.
You are absolutely compromised, and that's what Bracha's reading of Antigone is. She says, because I shared a womb with whatever it is, her brother was called, some Greek name, there is no other way to act. I can't make a decision to say, so when Hegel says Antigone is acting because she's a woman who's operating to some previous pre-social familial bond, and she should subject herself to the social political bond, where Creon says, this is the law and you mustn't break it, and you can't have people running around saying, your social law is fine, but I have an older, kinship law which says you can't kill my brother. She says it's not that. She says this is an irreplaceable figure of, because I shared the becoming in the same space. So what Bracha brings out of Sophocles' play is he already knew, in some sense, that there was this other bonding, which means that the very concept of the human subject is, from the most archaic moments of its ding into life of any sort, is a co-human. And being a co-human is a co-worlded subject, right? So I see Buddhism, like all the religions, they come into being to formulate an ethical model of how we should behave to the world. But it's evident that how many of those systems exist, they don't ask themselves, where from would we get something that's so primordial that we wouldn't, we just have to act with it, not act against the notion that you should be cruel and kill. 10 Commandments, you must not kill.
I agree with exactly that. And it's just there are several religions somewhere else. That's what men do when things go in and they come out again.
Buddhism functions as in the ethical code.
But in order to be a human being, in the sense of the idea of a beautiful being that's on the edge of the relaxation into being on the edge of a death, that there's nothing, the conversation ends in a situation of complete threat. There's a relaxation of being on the edge, well, there's nothing I can do. And there's a sort of beautiful moment of connectedness. And what I was trying to come from was, yes, everything that you say, I completely understand, and my wording isn't great. And that feeling of being connected with somebody else begins with an acceptance of their position. In that, being able to communicate with that person without barriers somehow, which does happen in moments. And that's what in my understanding of this text, not to say Bracker is going through that, but there are various things that make me have a feeling about that connectedness. That's all. But yes, I agree with you. You can't say, one religion has got it and another hasn't, because the religions are something else.
I'm not saying we've got distracted by religion. I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying you're saying it wrongly at all, right? Because you're perfectly stating something which is perfectly correct. It's just where psychoanalysis poses this is different from where the philosophical subject poses it. So I'm saying Buddhism counts as a philosophical code,
Okay. So
right?
somewhere in there is something that sorry, we just had this long conversation about this.
She said, how can we live it politically? Okay. Now,
How can we what?
live this politically?
Oh, that's interesting.
But
Who asked
this-
that question?
Brenda, but it
Oh,
takes
Brenda.
me to
Hi.
sorry. It takes me to what I've just been reading, which is the end note number 1, okay, on the page, which might kind of help. I'm not sure, because I was thinking the same thing when you were talking about Butler and how we've been reading Butler. It says, with communicating, communicare being the Latin verb for to share, I hope to elicit by resonance the idea of communicating by sharing, by caring within a matrixial transferential border space. Caring as a transferential affect is communicated without and beyond verbal communication. Communicating doesn't establish a community, but rather informs the matrixial border linking net, both inside and outside one's community. Community in inverted commas. This is a signifier of an ethical acting that evades political organisation while elaborating matrixial effects into the public sphere. Okay, so that's
Yes.
different to direct phallic political action, phallic in inverted commas, in the context of this text. Okay.
Well, if we had had the time, it would be the moment to read the gift and
Yes.
the question of the commons, because we would go from this very psychoanalytic, or let's say text-based, or using the tools of careful psychoanalytic thoughtfulness, and then approaching through that lens and tools a text by someone who doesn't come from those tools, doesn't use those tools, but comes from completely other political background, looking at, for example, property and common and so it would have been a good thing to read that one after, but it's difficult, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
I would like just to read a little bit more of this.
I think we should finish this.
Yeah, because
Absolutely,
I think
get one text.
But,
Absolutely.
but Brenda's point is a very good one, because
Yes.
it's also a point that Butler puts to Ettinger and Ettinger puts to Butler in one of the European graduate seminars exchanges, because all Ettinger is saying is she is putting on the table the proto-ethical resources and the proto-aesthetical resources that arise in her positing this archaic matrixial sphere. Then, as Alice has just read out, that when it moves into the public sphere, right, we are also at that point phallically constituted subjects who make decisions, right? So she's against the tendency now to say, well, politics is so kind of, debased, we must refound
the world post-Auschwitz on ethics alone. She says ethics alone won't found politics. So ethics is when I take up how should I behave towards the other, right? So I declare I will co-inhabit the planet with everybody who's here and everything that's on it, okay? But in certain situations, I will be confronted with a political choice, right? So I may be ethically disposed, and one of the, I don't know if this is going to work, one of the political choices that arises from the matrixial in one of the other passages on compassionate hospitality that I've quoted in my essay in the book Physiopolitics and Psychoanalysis is where she says, I can make the decision when faced with the perpetrator, in a sense where that I will refuse to let them take from me, I can't even get this, I had it with me, etc., but I refuse to let them destroy within me my own capacity for compassion, right? So you can decide, okay, in the end, I'm faced with a life and death situation, and it's my life or their life, etc. Or I can, which may be that, but so what Bracha does in a very concrete way is she goes to the occupied territories with a whole group of people who deliver medical and psychological services to various Palestinians who have very diminished resources for both, right? Physicians for Human Rights Israel, okay? So she went one day, okay, and there she was, providing this, and she looked tired, and man came up to her and said, come to my home and I'll give you tea or coffee. Now everybody in Israel is told, don't go to the occupied territories because the Palestinians want to kill you, and this man might be a Hamas person who wishes to kidnap her. And she stood there and she said, I have a decision to make, right? This could be the case, but I have to go with this man. Just like when people say, don't go to the occupied territories, she says, I have to go. The risk is that I will be kidnapped or I will be shot or whatever happened, because there are plenty of people who have every right to think any Israeli shouldn't be there, even if they came compassionately to deliver medical services. So she went with him, and that's for her the moment where, what does this mean in the political sphere? Is not to enter into the paranoia, which is actually endlessly producing this, even at the risk, and the very real risk, that this might have been a Hamas guy hanging around these people trying, for reasons that are not good reasons, because people are going to help us. And she went, and obviously she was taken to his house, and, it was hospitality. But so that's where I understand the sense you are sometimes faced where you have to make a political decision. Right? The ethical decision takes you to the occupied territories to provide assistance. Another occasion where one of the women there, her sister was living in the Negev, which is the other side, and was about to be displaced by yet her husband taking another wife, and he beat her and she was pregnant, but the Palestinian woman couldn't get a permit to go from the occupied, from the West Bank to Negev. So through the agitation that some of these Israelis do, they get the permit, but the Israeli government gave her a permit for 2 days, right? So when she's in the Negev looking after her daughter, her sister, and after about 2-3 weeks, she's got no way back, So Bracha went and got her, and they had this hilarious journey driving. So whenever they saw an Israeli soldier or checkpoint, this woman had to take a scarf off and put on her sunglasses and look Israeli, and then put a scarf back on again, all the way back. And at the end, the woman says, okay, now you're family, this is it. Okay, this gesture, meets a different kind of code of what it is to act towards another. Now that's an ethical gesture, but it also becomes a political one at the point at which you run up against the IDF or the state, and what she says is that what informs her decisions as to what she'll do on the political stage of resisting the occupation is, I refuse to let, even though there clearly there is potential violence from obviously within what we saw with the Viet Cong, with the national liberation struggle. It's a terribly violent thing, right? And there are the armed men who do not see the right of any Jew to live at all out of this history. But what's the decision she takes with regard to that moment when the man says, "I'll, come in my taxi and I'll take you home." So she said, I refuse to let, the situation deprive me of the, what I am now acting on.
The reverse also exists. I mean, there are so many lives in occupied territories that have been so devastated by being subjected to violence and growing up feeling foreign in your own land. And then the question also of, will you go? I mean, in other words, every experience, there's also the choice, will I be in an exhibition with Israeli artists or not?
Oh, absolutely.
Because of this, I've been sent back to Jordan so many times to get in from the other side to my home, that's also a strange political, dilemma, that I mean, the political dilemma is also always on so many different perspectives.
But in when you look at so many of the Palestinians, right, they're particularly the non-violent movement, it is extraordinarily humane.
Yeah.
In conditions of absolute, basically, 4 million people are kept in place by daily violence. That's why I was showing you yesterday this group of soldiers who have refused not to act.
The Israeli soldiers.
The Israeli soldiers who say this is it. So, I mean, I don't want to, but it's just to give you a precise example of what the sequence is between what this theory does in relation to when you move into how it resources an ethical.
It would be very interesting to have a kind of, I mean, to see her work also historically and sociologically as being an attempt also at going beyond this. I mean, very situated in this Israeli-Palestinian tragic thing.
It's situated. I mean, that's why I mentioned the Leverhulme before, because it's situated between the legacies of the Shoah and the. I mean, that's what.
In that sense,
the comparative the art time space, the migration, but on Bracha is that between what led people to be in Israel and the foundation of Israel, and what the catastrophe that then itself has produced.
It's very interesting because we've been talking about Bracha and Judith Butler for quite a while now, comparing, but also they are, as you mentioned, co-teaching in Geneva or wherever that is in Switzerland. And then they see each other apparently in Israel. But Judith Butler agrees with the cultural boycott and will go there privately and not as an official speaker. So and Bracha decided to move back and live in Tel Aviv and from Paris, or she goes to Paris, I don't know where she's mostly based, but so it's interesting also the consequences. I mean, this question of cohabit and co-inhabit that you brought up between the two perspectives is very deep, actually, and has these political consequences in the choice to adhere to the cultural boycott of Judith Butler and yet go. So it's like not putting the in cohabit.
Yes.
And the choice to publicly be living there, even though you disagree with the politics that are going on of your government, is like putting the in the inhabit. I mean, it's a kind of another analysis that we could go to.
But if you it is also practical living it out, isn't it? In a set of in one sense, a set of choices.
But it's again the sub. You know how the subconscious is always in the language. I mean, to go back to Daniel Heller, not subconscious is not his word at all, but that language harbors all these secrets, even to oneself. And mostly what's more interesting is that it harbors these mysteries rather than the secret, which one can somehow know what it is and one tames it. But the mystery, one doesn't really know what it is. And so that in this language, even in this language that they use, the choices, they are also embedded already as kernels, to use her word, these choices that are when the ethical becomes the political.
But actually,
It's very interesting.
it is. But you've just illustrated that, because what interests me is in actually how you live it,
Exactly.
and that's what those choices reveal.
But also, just to bring us back to how this fits into the whole theme of the Institute as well, it is a retreat and withdrawal in one sense because, well, there are two things. I mean, my passionate purpose in life is to try and understand how the actual form and processes of Brache's artwork is the site of this happening and from which this arrives. So by reading in very formalist terms, things. So the work of superimposing these traces through the photocopier, layer after layer after layer, of materialized traces that destroy the image, refuse the gaze that's inherent in the photographic image, and layer things produces the very possibility for me understanding what co-inhabitation is in a time space. Because there is a page, and layering different moments of the history of Palestine and the history of her own family and its displacement and all the rest of it, and the trauma of war and all the rest of it, allows you to actually, once by describing what it is that has been made, you are describing something that holds in that aesthetic form what is now being presented theoretically. It arrives from that, which is, so for instance, you could say the Israeli-Palestinian situation is a site of co-inhabited memory of trauma and disaster, and they are co-emergent. There was not a Palestinian problem before there was an Israeli state. The Israeli state is defined by the nature of its relationship to the Palestinians. These two are not inseparable. It's not, oh dear,
yes.
there were, but this is a co-inhabited land with layers and layers and layers of memory. So I was talking to one of these IDF soldiers who's involved in this program called Breaking the Silence. His father comes from a family that for 9 generations has lived in Jerusalem. Right? His mother comes from a family that was in Hamburg, went to America, and she married an Israeli. Now, those 9 generations are real. They coexisted, right? The Jews coexisted in Israel with the Palestinians, etc., in different sorts of ways, at different times, with Christians also. So there's layers and layers and layers. So it needs this archaeological sense of it. Now, this is not to justify anything, but it just is the notion of cohabitation and co-inhabitation is there from the very instance. And this is the negative trauma, right? But it's also the potentially providential, creative possibility, because you can't say the solution is, you cannot. There's no way that the Palestinians can live a life of national freedom, squeezed up into 4 million of them into a tiny piece of land where they don't have access to water and they don't control the roads, and colonized by all these hideous people living on top of the hills with an air force going above them all the time. So this is not, and you can put a wall up, it's not good. There's got to be a way in which the imagination is that the life of these two peoples just happen to be there. They shouldn't be there in certain kinds of ways, but they are, and they have tentacles going back and long histories of different empires, etc. There's got to be a solution which is a co-inhabituation, which is soliciting the life in the fullness of it. No more children should ever be born in that space into either the trauma that's inflicted on the Palestinians or the deformation of humanity that is the condition of being Israeli.
Yeah, maybe the solution is to move to the side and look at it from a more worldly perspective.
I'm sure. But indeed,
because sometimes you can't get out of situations that are political unless you redefine what politics are. Exactly. I mean, it has to do with water, with environment,
that's exactly.
and with also the commons. I mean, this question of borders in general is a kind of a mad idea.
Perfect. Exactly.
Anyway, I mean, yeah. So there we go.
And this question of love.
Love, the question of love.
So I just want to read one particular paragraph, which again links to this, because I do feel you're absolutely right. And that's part of what these institutes have been about, and your 3 lectures have been about, which is in some sense, the specificity of the brain, then the question of the welding and the compost, as opposed to the archive, the generativeness, the sense of, and very much focusing on the question of life. And then by this particular, when you asked us yesterday, why did you start this lectures, in one sense that repositions the problem or the issue around the subject, the witness, right? And how do we move through all the kinds of positions that come out from that, in some sense, subject position, to relate and link to some of the other positions, in some sense by means of the, what Brack's called the aesthetic practices, the art, the things that art making does, discloses, the knowledge that comes. And one of the themes of our original project was, in what sense can art be knowledge, produce knowledge, can art be a form of research?
Yes.
Right? And in
Yes.
some ways, this is a very, very highly specialized issue, but as we've begun to see, we need thinking apparatuses, and we need the thinking apparatus of the latest in quantum physics. We need the thinking apparatus of the latest in the biological sciences. We need questions of epigenetics. We need these different thinking apparatuses to confront some of the complexity.
Yes, maybe to
And-
make it bigger and make it
and
more.
that this is
to
therefore
imagine more
not one
stories.
theory versus another theory.
Yeah.
So when she says, I'm just offering a thinking apparatus that transgresses certain boundaries, just as in a sense you've been constantly making me kind of transgress my Western post-structuralist, semiotic, Marxist, psychoanalytical, so that's my world, okay, this is, but in fact the transgression doesn't lead to dissolution and complete confusion.
Not at all.
It sets us
Supplemental.
to these
What
things,
she
and
calls
this,
supplemental.
your larger sense that there's this world, or what she's going to call the cosmos. There are within that relations to some others that have, kind of certain immediate demands on us to do with what we think of as the ethical or the political. There are also any other non-eyes that may not be sentient or human eyes. I still think she's not quite in that space with you in a sense. But this line, when it starts, Hiroshima as the Japanese man's name. So Hiroshima, actually it's two words, Hiroshima as the Japanese man's name and as trauma and love is a hospitable host when those enter the position of a non-eye for an eye that responds to a foreigner's wounds. Okay, so Hiroshima is the trauma and love, is hospitable host when those enter the position of non-eye, a non-eye for an eye, that responds to a foreigner's wounds by sharing in her suffering, communicating compassion in compassion. By that kind of safeness that Hiroshima affords, we realize that war and peace don't have the same origin. They are not one another's opposites. Sacrifice and revenge has nothing to do with peace. Conciliation, like gratitude, like empathy, is secondary. They can follow both compassion and abjection, while compassion within primary compassion is originary, and compassion is the originary event of peace.
Yes, exactly.
So peace is not the sort of opposite of war. You have either war or peace. It itself has a kind of an originary status. So in awareness to the enormous transmissivity between beings, it becomes clear that only sharing in one another's suffering in compassionate witnessing brings safety, and that hurting the other in the real of fragile coexistence devastates also the psyche of the self, because in the matrixial sphere, imprints from the traumatized other will reach one's own psyche transmissively. Peace is a fragile encounter-eventing, an ever co-created and co-recreated, fragile and fragilizing encounter-event. Under the matrixial epistemological parameters, in the feminine, compassion, primary compassion, and compassionate hospitality give birth to responsibility, while responsibility gives birth to adult compassion. To the extent that all these human possibilities of access and passage to the other should not be apprehended apart, though their combination is not a thought, but to begin with affect and practice, which particular aesthetic blinding spot becomes an ethical point of view. In the knot of love and trauma, under this eros, beauty bends towards the sublime.
Ah, she used the word sublime.
Yeah, but it
Bends
beauty bends towards it. The artistic textual fruit of trans-inscription and cross-inscription that I have called transcriptum is a poetic passage to the almost otherness that conducts, in the sense of conducting, not conducting, but passaging, this feminine transgression from the aesthetical to the ethical, since it includes witnessing that reactivates compassion and primary compassion. Different aspects of trauma and jouissance are dispersed by and with affect and act, and their traces circulate between an I and a foreigner. Older psychic events are transformed and their traces fade away and get dispersed in others that become the witnesses to the trauma of the non-I and even of the non-I's others. When matrixial eros fatally meets sexual eros in reciprocal love, as in Hiroshima Mon Amour, the healing power of traumatizing love is at its height. In Nevers, with the past traumatized love, the eros of attachment joined in two. In Hiroshima, with the present traumatized love, the eros of attachment is lacking. The lovers will possibly leave one another, and so the blinding power of border linking in beauty and fascinance glows even more in its uniqueness. The healing potentiality of a love without possession, be it sexual possession or attachment possession, this ultimate tragic yet sublime fate of the maternal future principle is revealed. On this side of the matrixial feminine difference, the Japanese man suffers from the immemoriality of the other woman, of the past and of the world, and labors to transport traces of and from the cryptid phantoms of the other woman and of the world, and of his people's catastrophe, into the light of partial visibility. If the aesthetic question engages both the relations between death and the beautiful, and the linkage between the passage from non-life to life and the beautiful, then in desiring to transform non-life, not yet life, and no more life, of itself or of the world into a scenario of the not one soul in severality, where jouissance and trauma can meet by the grace of witnessing and communicating, the Japanese man as woman, feeling and knowing from inside the apparatus of this feminine difference, engage in co-emerging, co-fading, becoming the dead lover, becoming the living lover, allowing trans and cross-inscription of traces of memory of oblivion by his own real. This Japanese man as a woman weaves the fragmented and partially interlaced transsubjectivity by rendering itself fragile and in co-inhabiting the border space between being dead and becoming lover, attracts new virtual scenarios with the forces of his names. Hiroshima, my love. Matrixial compassionate hospitality as eros that offers the possibility of the other to differentiate herself in jointness creates a psychic time-space where the other is solicited by a particular configuration of jouissance and desire inside transference to join a space of virtuality and potentiality, to join in what is yet to come from the virtual sphere and from the future. While traumatizing love yields the boundaries of the self to include the pain and the wonder of the other, the past and the world, the Japanese man witnesses in love whatever arrives, longing and languishing, past catastrophe, the horror of death, and first of all the trauma of love itself, in empathic contemplation, in empathy within compassion that is wide enough to the matrixial eros that manifests itself in the tension between the originary psychoethical openness and aesthetical trance-sensing meets the sexual eros. The introduction of sexual intimacy in this fragile state of self-relinquishment creates new occasions for re-traumatizing and healing at precisely the same psychic locus since the opening of infantile fragility by mature sexuality is traumatizing. In that sense, sexual adult love always touches the impossible, as it is always by definition psychically transgressive. This is where fascinance enters, to reveal a passionate, active passivity in eros, maintained only if a border linking within real, virtual, traumatic or phantasmatic encounter events meets with the compassionate hospitality of this maternal quality in the lover. This motherly quality in love, treasuring residuals of archaic fragility in the border linking, is traumatizing in itself. Within co-inhabitu assign, I don't know if that was happening, co-inhabitu assign, in the spirit, I think that must be an ing, co-inhabituating in the spirit of love and besidedness, the archaic maternal time-space thrusts its potentiality into awareness that can reach the field of vision when the film text creates a field of resonance. So with this co-inhabituating the spirit of love and beside the archaic maternal time-space thrusts its potentiality into awareness that can reach the field of vision when the film text creates a field of resonance. So this is where does the aesthetic practice actually happen? It creates a field of resonance that actualizes compassionate hospitality. And when a breathing, touch, gaze, naming, move, practices love, solace and grace do deepen fragility, but the surplus of fragility is not sacrificial. The sovereignty of a mature matrixial encounter is revealed precisely there. The Japanese man witnessed the French woman's trauma without, a direct experience of the event that caused it many years before, by becoming, through the figure of Shekhinah love, a subjective object of this past event, and thus sharing it while transforming it, reproducing the almost same encounter event with indifference, while attracting from virtuality through communicating a healing spring encapsulated as the kernel of love as its traumatic potentiality. You can't see Hiroshima with your phallic or generalizing gaze. You can only access Hiroshima through touch gazing and reopening the wounds of your own traumatic past, so that Hiroshima becomes momentarily and eternally also your own dead non-I, now spiritually alive in the sense of widening new ethical horizons for yourself because of a new I and a non-I transconnectedness that by its absorbance of dead lovers within love's compassionate hospitality becomes a communicating, traumatizing love. And I just wanted to get to the end there because it's at that point you can see that she can only get there because she's seen the film. She's actually seen the film, not with a phallic seeing of the film, but with this other kind of fascinance that's waited long enough to see how it becomes a place where it's not just a film about love, but you would aesthetically experience in its particular sort of cinematic form the affect that has been produced. So on a sort of phallic level, you can say who did what in this film, what's happening here, what's it about. But something in the cinematic text allows a tipping, going back into visibility and visibility, into a kind of visibility, this impossible, i.e. the invisible, this inarticulable set of traces, affects, resonances, movements that then generate, as it were, as the aesthetic effect for the subject who encounters it. So we are not witnesses to the film, nor just spectators of it, but when it does its work, its art working, we are also witnesses because we have to somehow fragilize ourselves in different sort of way and experience the risk of the traumatizing exposure to this kind of vulnerability that in fact most films where they just simply do show you, You know, you say, okay, now we have in the household, it was called ice cream. Okay, they're going to have the sex act for a while. Who wants to watch other people having sex? But you may wish to watch this film, which is extremely erotic way, because it folds between the mature sexual eros of the man and the woman, this, you know, layered histories of his trauma as a Japanese man from Hiroshima, you know, her trauma as this French woman in that sort of way. So I mean, I'm going back to the story, but something, what is it that what you would call, how this film is a transport station of trauma? Where is the transformation, which is both, in a sense, measured out in the cinematic duration that solicits your fascinance for long enough to perhaps see something that isn't semiotically plotted into the track, but is the metamorphic aesthetics of shift and passage and tempo and rhythm and black and whiteness and, you know, the sort of all that grain and all that texturing and stuff, and how it's shot in close-ups and not close-ups, and, you know, in relation to you, where you can't quite see what you're seeing, or you're you're too close or too far and all the rest of it. That it's actually at the very puzzled. It's absolutely at the aesthetic of the film. That if you run this paper with the film, you're going to sort of know something that kind of had to have a kind of long linguistic sort of neologistic plot. But if you try and say, what is she telling me? What do I know? What will I get? What is this like? You don't get its movement, which is deeply respectful of what the film is doing.
Can I share some thoughts?
Yeah.
Which might not come out in a straight line or even finish. It feels to me, reading this and thinking about the film, they're new things to me. I'm not that familiar with them at all. I'm not familiar with them. But it's like she's inhabiting this co-inhabituating space to make sense of her world and the world you describe of her going to Israel and this sort of experience, which you describe, which becomes simple in its description, but is far more complex even beyond that experience. And it feels like she's writing this text, which is this combination of her a language, cohabiting a language, co-inhabiting a language, co-inhabiting this artistic and creative space that she is living and learning and existing in. And I think the thing as well with the aunts, the ongoing, the pulling in from all of history that becomes now that we'll all go into all of the future. And then this relationship with the film, which feels in a little bit to me as if that's an external artistic presentation of her co-inhabiting and her writing that makes sense of it in another way, that's another forum, another presentation that's happening alongside in a past, present, future thing. And it all makes sense to me as well in relation to Castle, in terms of the Leverhulme, in terms of the ecology, in terms of a snapshot picture of lots of different things that are these co-inhabituating things that are happening that we all kind of weave in and out of. Touch on that severing, including.
I think you're absolutely right.
Very interesting.
I mean, we don't want to clump everything together, but there are these parallel pressures to break out of phallocentric framing or Western-centric or human-centric, anything that sort of centers on a certain position of knowing versus a kind of passive other, as opposed to this. And I think it's crucial that we hold, as you've brought back, these are all coexisting
The reading, breathing.
Yeah, elements of trying to position us or deposition us or to co-position us in relation to all sorts of questions of life, and that this is very much concerned with. I mean, it's based in art making. So this is an artist talking, and I just, in one sense, to pick up on what you said, but just to remind us. The very crucial point which she makes in here, which is the Japanese man as woman.
Yes.
And that question of, she's in a paper she wrote many years ago called the Artist as Woman, that it's the position, so it relates to your notion by what is the position that from which you address the world. And so she's potentially saying, since that it's not that artists are men and artists are women in the gendered sense, but the artist can function as this matrixial feminine, irrespective of gender, in relation to this disposition. Right?
Yes.
It's that disposition,
Yes.
you know, and it's a disposition of compassionate hospitality, but it is also, and I think this is the crucial addition to what you've been adding that we could mix in, picking up what you're saying. When you mix in compassion, right, it is an orientation to understanding that this world is wounded.
Yes.
And that there is this terrible level of violence towards the world, to the living things, and that until we can understand what its foundations are, so it wasn't enough to condemn it, saying they did it, they caused it. We have to have another figure that counters what, in a sense, all of us are constructed as. We're all constructed to be the phallic one. Irrespective of our gender, we inhabit it. We've made a fuss about this thing, well, maybe we're not quite in it, so we've got this sort of thing called women, who sort of say that we're not really it, but we actually are, we're just as phallic as everyone else, and feminism is just as deeply fitted by its own phallicism and paranoia and all the rest of it. It actually is a move where you open this other space, and that's the most difficult thing I find to explain, but anybody can operate from this position.
But not always.
But not always, but this is, so it is a kind of position. So it's not an ontology.
No, but it's really vital, because it's this, swerving of the matrixial through the phallus, which in the early work is really very, very important.
But,
so it's not that you can suddenly switch over to being matrixial rather than being phallic. Okay.
but we can be solicited.
We can be solicited,
We
and
can be seduced into it.
There is the possibility that there is another structure, which is the theoretical work that gets done, for these things that we feel in kind of affective ways.
And to go back to the sort of...
it's really, really important to say that...
We're missing you.
That, the phallic and the matrixial can be there at once to a greater or a lesser extent. And that it is this sense of the matrixial passing through the phallic that's really important for me, I think. Because it feels like it could be easy to switch from one to the other, but it's not a case of that at all, because that's reinstalling the phallic paradigm. So you can't think about it in that way.
But that's why the film works, because it's not just an externalization, it actually is in some sense the aesthetic form is one of the ways we can access our kind of sense knowing of the matrixial. So you're not going to be convinced of it by reading the text, but you may if you watch the film or read the novel or follow up or look at the artwork. And it's happening all the time in lots of artworks. It may be, in fact, the very capacity we have to let art make a difference. And this question of bringing in languages, the notion of fascinos, but even love, and also the willingness to let ourselves be the transport station.
Yes.
So in some ways, to go back to the film we watched yesterday, Din is he actually... He in one sense, there is a kind of transport, but that's what the process of he was not just witnessing what the Vietnamese National Liberation artists did, he was witnessing in a certain way that delivered it to our, and then we come away with thinking as something more about their worlding than we could have imagined. Brenda looked very...
One comment or possible question. I was wondering whether the idea about man as woman, or that particular character, comes from a conversation with Guattari, because he's developed, conceptualized, theorized the feminine in kind of, so there are one or two interviews.
You mean in the
They
film?
still,
No.
they still think of the
Yeah.
feminine as the other of the
No,
masculine.
not in such a phallic terms. I mean, I can, if you're interested, I can show you. This was just a thought, and the other thing.
But why, excuse me,
Certain-
why does it matter for us to find something like it?
It doesn't matter, but you brought up Kant and you brought up other people, Levinas.
Yeah,
Men,
but then we
for
have
me.
to bring up Nietzsche.
So,
I mean, then
yes.
there's no point in saying
No.
Guattari.
I was just-
I mean, Guattari it's a Nietzschean idea. I mean, this evoking of the feminine or also of the animality, I think, comes from a tradition of idealization, romantic idealization.
Could be. I don't know.
Of
enough.
alterity in a certain tradition of male. You know, the flying vaginas.
Yeah.
The flying vaginas
Okay.
referred to by Deleuze.
Don't.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, this is an arts. Welcome.
Don't really want to. It's
No, but-
it's
but-
not.
but-
Let's
So
discuss
this
that question over lunch.
this is one thing,
But I
and
think
the
it's
other.
really important because not to discuss whether Guattari is the source of any in this particular case, but because there is, of course, how do you say, a competition over territories of intellectual work, and it's a very violent competition. And I find that, for example, the reference is always to Derrida, and l'animal que donc je suis. When you have Jane Goodall and you have all this stuff going on in science, in ethology and in philosophy, okay, well before Derrida decides that he's the first that brings the question of the animal back into philosophy. And with Guattari, I think this happens a lot with ecology. So people who start saying, political ecology, so we go back to Guattari, the four ecologies. The four ecologies is a devastating, bad text. If you read it, it's so bad because it defines the four ecologies in a completely patriarchal way, which gets, the ecology of the smallest, it's like in the scale thing, it's like a scale. It's not turtles all the way down, or it's the ecology of, love or whatever, of a system, very personal system, the environment, the political, and it has this hierarchy, where the political ecology is like the most superior of all, and then all of these others that go through, then environmentalism is a little bit lower, and so on. So it brings these very important and crucial issues into a grid, which is a forma mentis that I think still is old and patriarchal. Also the idea of schizoanalysis, to me. So I disagree with Sueli, Rolnick, who considers this idea of schizoanalysis coming from Guattari as, it is of course important, but you can go to the same result through many other avenues that don't need to go through constructed formal psychiatry and then the breakage of it with anti-psychiatry. And Guattari had people with electric stuff going on in his clinic, electroshocks where's the name of the clinic? La Borde or whatever. So I don't know about, I think that evoking Deleuze and Guattari always, especially us who find affinities with their thinking, we think, oh, finally, some men who think in a different way, more complex, and is also hitting yourself on the head. In fact, Vinciane Després, I want to send it to you, wrote a very beautiful essay once called, I had never read Deleuze, it's Donna Haraway also who does that in her second chapter. Where
She takes them apart.
she takes him apart, but then there's this other text that says, I had never read Deleuze. I came to all this without Deleuze. It wasn't necessary. So I think we have to also remember that we can come to things without Guattari in naming the anti-psychiatry.
But it's also an academic training to do that. That's
Okay.
I had a second question, but not related to it.
Well, I think, can we
more
have
interesting
this
for me.
discussion over lunch more formally, because
We're informal.
Carolyn now has to have another discussion
Yeah,
to
okay.
do with forces moving under waters
Yeah,
and
yeah.
all the rest of it.
But
etc.
I would like to take this moment to, in any case, Brenda, say this
Right,
is
we'll
only
have some
just the
to answer.
beginning. These 3 institutes and 3 lectures is only just the beginning, right? It's always only just the beginning. And I'm coming back in July for what will be, I think, a reversed situation where I'm going to be listening to everyone else, others, and hopefully people taking apart a little bit the documenta, and therefore we're responding as you are now. So I think that might be a moment where you can make a talk, and we can retake this from this moment, from the Guattari. Bracha could be the beginning of a very interesting intervention that you might bring to me